Hold on one moment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Thank you. We're live.
Great. Good morning. It's December the 18th, 2020, and I want to welcome everyone to this House Judiciary Committee briefing. It's a virtual committee briefing, so we ask for your patience if we encounter any technological or streaming issues. Before we begin, I remind committee members that the briefing is being streamed live on the Maryland General Assembly's YouTube channel. Committee members will be muted through the briefing. If you have a question, type question in all capital letters in the chat box on the right side of your window. I'll call on delegates to ask questions. After I call your name, please wait a moment until Dylan unmutes you and you're able to ask your question on the Zoom. Today, the Judiciary Committee will receive briefings related to mental health and law enforcement from two sides of this issue. It's not really necessarily opposing sides. We're going to feature a conversation on the mental health of police officers and then how law enforcement officers engage with people who might be in mental health crisis. From our first panel, we'll receive a briefing on the mental health of law enforcement officers, and we'll hear from two police and public safety psychologists, Dr. Ellen Scrivener and Dr. Heather McElroy. This panel will be followed by a question and answer session. Then we'll receive a briefing from local crisis response teams on community intervention strategies. We'll hear from Anne Arundel County, and we'll hear from Lieutenant Steve Thomas of the Anne Arundel County County Intervention Team, and Jennifer Corbin, the Crisis Intervention Director of the Anne Arundel County Mental Health Agency. From Howard County, we'll hear from Sergeant Mark Orlowski, the supervisor of the Howard County Police Department's Mental Health Section in the Community Outreach Division, Officer Megan Holloway, the department's mental health liaison, and Dr. Mariana Israelson, the Executive Director of Grassroots Crisis Intervention Center. And then from Baltimore City, we'll hear from Edgar Wiggins, the Executive Director of Baltimore Crisis Response Incorporated. That second panel will be followed by a question and answer session. Our third panel, we will receive feedback on these topics and a briefing on the Greater Baltimore Region Integrated Crisis System, or GBRICS, from behavioral health professionals, providers, and community advocates. We'll hear from Gail Claus, a volunteer with NAMI, Adrienne Bridenstine, the Vice President of Policy and Communications at the Behavioral Health System of Baltimore, Tiffany Callender Erbelding, the Program Director of the Horizon Foundation, and Nikki McCann, the Vice President of Provider and Payer Transformation in the Johns Hopkins Health System. This third panel will then be followed by a question and answer session. Members of the committee are aware that we're going to have several question and answer sessions throughout the day. The chair, while normally is forgiving on second bites of the apple, may be a little less forgiving depending on how we're doing on time today. So please keep that in mind in order to keep us on track and hopefully finished by 12 o'clock. All right, we're going to start with Dr. Scrivener and Dr. McElroy, and when you're prepared, you can start, whoever would like to begin.
Okay, you want me to start?
Sure, sounds good.
I think you had my name on the agenda first, so I will start. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to discuss mental health and law enforcement, and I salute the Judiciary Committee for your interest, since it is becoming a very critical issue in law enforcement today. As Dr. McElroy will illustrate with her presentation, a lot of work and research has gone into hiring the right people for this important job, then training them to conform to strong professional standards, also providing certifying them until they have met requisite state standards. Given that background, it's not surprising that many people have looked at law enforcement as a well-trained force that protects our communities. And it wasn't until a succession of police shootings, most of which were caught on camera, that demands to defund police, to rethink police, and to institute police reform really started to accelerate. Many forget, however, that questionable police abuse actually started much earlier on than in the recent shootings, going back to Rodney King in 1991 and the riots in LA when the 4 officers who beat him were declared not guilty. However, the more recent numbers of police shooting cases, along with the televised coverage and the social media dialogue, have permitted the public to see more of the details, and communities then began to seriously question police behavior. As the more recent shootings increased, they culminated in events that brought about significant community unrest, and as we have all seen, outright anger surfacing in marches and protests, and questions were raised about how law enforcement did what they called protection. And many, not just Black Lives Matter participants, did not like what they saw and began to demand police reform, all of which is officer wellness. Officer mental health and wellness are more significant today since officers are now encountering a level of disregard that has accelerated and has created a very negative image of the police officer. So in addition to the day-to-day stress and traumatic incidents that are part of the job, police officers now encounter waves of anti-police sentiment and calls for the need to reimagine policing as we know it. This is all further complicated by issues related to the pandemic, since many departments are experiencing the removal of large numbers of officers from the streets because of COVID-19. So we're now seeing the development of some additional chaos in departments across the country. However, what we're not paying that much attention to is how is all of this affecting police officer health and that of their families. Nothing of how it is affecting the interest and intention of becoming a police officer, since recruitment is really starting to become very difficult. So it's a much broader picture, but given the command and control culture of policing, law enforcement has been a little late in prioritizing the protection of the health and wellness of police. While there's been a strong and substantive focus on responding to police reactions to shootings and to traumatic incidents, there's been less national attention focused on the impact on the mental health of police officers in terms of how they spend their days at work. Typically, they are continually responding to critical issues that can vary from domestic beatings or child abuse, responding to auto accidents that have decimated the bodies of passengers, to responding to outright murders or seeing the results of people being held hostage, responding to the homeless, and to crisis related to the mentally ill or to substance abuse. This ongoing exposure to all that is going wrong in the world takes its toll, and all of this hits police officers shortly after they leave the academy. This doesn't happen just grow over time. This hits them in the face within a short time out of the academy, but it's considered to be part of the job and they're supposed to grow up and take it. Consequently, there's little wonder that after witnessing and responding to those types of events, when the officer comes home and their spouse says something like, the washing machine doesn't work or the mortgage payment is late, the officer thinks, so what? After what I have dealt with all day, then their own domestic issues start to flare up and their family members feel that they have less prominence in the officer's life and that the police job is changing their spouse. It doesn't have to be this way. In fact, a group that combined people from different sectors of the U.S. Department of Justice, including the COPS Office and the Bureau of Justice Assistance, started a group about 10 years ago that started to focus on officer safety and wellness. The OSW group is called, and they sought to raise awareness, increase knowledge, and encourage law enforcement agencies to adopt efforts to improve officer safety and wellness, and to bring together law enforcement practitioners, researchers, and subject matter experts to amplify new and existing efforts to improve safety and wellness. They've also from the major police organizations, such as IACP or Major City Chiefs Organization. OSW was a good start. And when the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing in 2015 declared officer safety and wellness one of its 6 established pillars, attention was accentuated. With that type of emphasis, law enforcement today is becoming even more aware of the need to ensure that officers have the kind of mental health services they need in addition to maintaining their physical health and developing resilience. They're also becoming far more focused on suicide prevention since the number of suicides, police suicides, have been increasing to the point that officer suicides are exceeding officers shot in the line of duty. In my own profession, psychologists and several members on the other panels have been involved in this as well. Initially, we were not all that well received, and we had to prove to officers that we were not there to hurt or demean them, or report them to their supervisors and get them fired. Rather, we were there to help them with therapeutic intervention, with stress management, with dealing with post-traumatic stress, with crisis intervention, and to work with individual officers, but also at times with whole squads or divisions and with management. Our gradual acceptance may have been one of the first steps that started to change the leadership culture, which over the years has been seen as one of the major drawbacks to confirming police officer mental health and wellness as a significant issue in the policing world, and one that also impacts how they respond to citizens. That early change in culture development is now emerging to the point that some departments now talk about their officers as being guardians in the community, in contrast to warriors who fight crime. They've also embraced stronger relationships and collaborative problem solving with the community. As you will hear from another panel, the development of crisis response teams and community interventions are becoming a lot more prevalent. That said, we still have a way to go because an officer's tendency to seek help may seek help. If it gets out, will other officers be afraid to work with you, thinking you don't have what it takes to be a cop? Just a couple of some of the unique risk factors of the cop culture. Despite those fears, psychological services and law enforcement is now more recognized across the country. And police and public safety psychology is a recognized specialty. Psychologists have expanded their work and supported initiatives that have led to deaths, and as well as supporting police management to do a number of things, to create a culture that supports officer health and wellness, to develop peer support so that seeking help is not viewed as a sign of weakness, but as strength to face the issues, furthering the notion that we're all in this together while helping officers to see a much needed holistic and compassionate approach by leadership, and helping departments develop a vision that all are doing their job while building toward a healthy retirement and a career life well lived. In this regard, officer safety and wellness as the sixth pillar of the President's Task Force has been a major step in confirming the importance of officer physical and mental health. But there's one qualification that we need to consider, and that may be important to this Judiciary Committee. That qualification is that when we're proposing wellness programs, we need to be aware that the evidence on the effectiveness of wellness programs is quite variable, as are the programs themselves. And we're learning that as programs vary across the country, all need to be evaluated to determine what works best. Now, I'm talking specifically about wellness programs, not the mental health programs that have been established in many police departments' programs. Research analysis in 2019 officers from approximately 200 police departments across the country, and determined that while they had many different avenues of support in their department, many did not know that their departments had wellness programs. In contrast, there are some departments where their focus on officer wellness has promoted significant change, where mental health and physical fitness of officers is a priority, and where departments encourage peer support, and some may include even 8 hours of wellness training before entering the field training as part of their professional development. That's a very new procedure. Given the different approaches, clearly there is a need to develop a body of systemic research on the topic of police wellness to determine what works best in programs for specific types of wellness programs. And we need police leadership to be supportive of promoting this type of research. In addition to supporting research, there is still the need to strengthen the culture that supports mental health, and that culture needs to show how law enforcement provides support for handling trauma, for allowing conversations with safe and positive messages that build resilience and healthy coping skills, sending messages that it's okay to seek help and there are no barriers to mental health care. Also, that it's okay to talk about suicide. Talking about it doesn't mean you're going to do it, but the fact that it's crossed your mind suggests you need to get that out in the open. And to promote the idea that peers engaged in supportive activities are there to help, and you do not need to be fearful of their rejection. All of these issues need to be considered when developing legislative responses, and legislation can clearly help, particularly in helping to build a strong research base that provides solid direction for how police mental health and wellness programs can be interwoven throughout the police culture. All will benefit at-risk citizens in particular, but also the police officers who go out there every day and put their life on the line. A healthy police department will help get this done. I thank you for your interest in this subject and for your time and attention.
Dr. Scrivener, very briefly, just to ask a quick question. If you could just share with the committee, your credentials, where you work, and a little bit more about your experience.
Oh dear, do you have longer than 15 minutes? I started out, as many of you will be familiar with, started out working in the Fairfax County Police Department. I was working in a community mental health center, and the police chief came over and said, I need somebody to help me put together something like psychological testing for applicants. They didn't have anything like that. And nobody wanted to do it because, frankly, everybody was a little bit concerned about working with the police at that time. I thought it sounded very interesting, and I thought it was an opportunity to really make a contribution. So I took it on, even though a lot of my colleagues mental health center said, don't bring the cops in here. Of course, a lot of them smoking weed in their auto, so they didn't want any part of me being around there with police. But I worked with Fairfax County, and then worked there for quite a while, and then ended up going over to Prince George's County, and actually became part of the command staff in Prince George's County as their chief psychologist. And we didn't do any testing. They had a psychiatrist do the testing. So I did all kind of just on-site mental health work and worked with the SWAT team, and did a lot of, I was on 24-hour call and had a lot of experience with police use of excessive force, because that was a big issue at that time in Prince George's. That led me into the Justice Department because I got a fellowship to study police use of excessive force, and it just happened to coincide with the time that Bill Clinton was elected, and they passed the '94 Crime Act, and they started the COPS office, and the Attorney General, Janet Reno, had read some of my questions and my research of wondering if community policing would be helping to reduce excessive force. And she took that on, and they sent me to the COPS office to help set that up. And I was at the COPS office for a very long time, and eventually actually came to Chicago as a deputy superintendent for administration in the department. I was only there for 3 years. I went on to John Jay in New York and would probably need to join their administration. And I was the deputy director for the National Institute of Justice. So I stayed there, and then finally thought it's time to retire and to do other things that are not requiring, I be someplace on a 9-to-5 job. Although my jobs were never 9 to 5, they always went much longer, as I'm sure yours do. So I do a lot of work now with police reform and working on consent decrees, things of that nature, but all as a consultant at this point. I hope I got that in a short enough period of time.
You did just fine. You did just fine. Thank you very much, Dr. Scrivener. We'll take questions from the committee as a whole in a moment, but I would like to go to Dr. McElroy, please.
Hi all, thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. As you've heard, Dr. Scrivener was one of the founding people of the field of police and public safety psychology. So I'm really honored to have been asked to speak alongside her today. Our field is really young when you consider that we started to develop research in this area back in the 70s and early 80s. We weren't even recognized as a specialty until 2011. So I'm really thankful that mental health and law enforcement has become really more of a topic of discussion, particularly in the past several years. And more importantly, officer safety and wellness, which has really become a huge topic of discussion, especially within the IACP. They have even instituted an officer safety and wellness symposium. The third annual Officer Safety and Wellness Symposium is being held in San Antonio in March. I encourage anybody who can attend to go to that symposium. I guess I'll start a little bit by introducing myself. I started in the field of police and public safety psychology right out of internship back in 2006. I didn't even know it was a field of work. I met Dr. Tony Stone in Atlanta. He's also one of the founding fathers of police and public safety psychology. And I fell in love with the work immediately. I really enjoyed the opportunity to be able to work doing pre-employment screening. And it felt like I was really contributing something to the community and to the officers by making sure that we're getting the right people in the door from the beginning. After about 5 years, one of my chiefs asked me if I had any interest in going through the academy. So I said, sure, why not? And worked full-time and also went to the police academy part-time for about 6 months. So I've been a certified police officer since 2011 and worked for the hostage negotiation team for probably 6 or 7 years doing call outs. And I only stopped doing that because SWAT, as you guys may know, tends to go in there pretty quickly. And so by the time I would arrive on scene, because I was about 45 minutes away from my department, they'd tell me to turn around and go back home. So I now volunteer with another department, helping them with criminal investigations. But I've been certified since 2011. I've been managing partner of a police and public safety psychology firm, Stone McElroy and Associates, in the Atlanta area. And we primarily do pre-employment screening, psychological fitness for duty evaluations, critical incident debriefing, and psychoeducation to include wellness training, which is actually pretty new for us because, like Dr. Scribner said, this is not a topic that's been well discussed or well received in a lot of agencies until more recently. I'm seeing a lot more of my departments calling me and asking me, what can we do? We want to do better. Most recently, I had a department ask me, can we do annual wellness visits? And I said, sure. And they said, we don't have the budget for that right now. What else can we do until we get the budget approved for annual wellness visits? And so I said to them, let's do some wellness training. So we've actually recently developed a survey to try to get some research on what officers want, what they need, what barriers to treatment they see at this point. We've already got 30 responses and we recently launched it. So I'm really excited because the department's only about 50 strong. So we're looking forward to getting that started. But what I really want to talk to you guys about today is the pre-employment process. Dr. Scribner mentioned how important it is to make sure that we get the right people in the door. When we first started talking about police reform in the wake of bias and tolerance issues, I heard a lot of people talk so much about training, right? We need to do de-escalation training. We need to do mental health training. Well, if the people that we are training don't have the intellectual ability to learn the things that we're trying to teach them, or they don't have the tolerance, the responsibility, the self-control, or the integrity, all of that training isn't going to be worth our while because we've already got the wrong people in the door. So pre-employment to me is the first step in making sure that we're building a force that has the traits and characteristics that they need to be able to handle the job, not only at the beginning of their career, but to also have that resilience to develop throughout their career and to learn those things that they need to learn and to not become hardened as they interact with people day in and day out. It's what they do see is something very different than what the rest of the community sees. And they need to be able to have that resilience to deal with that. So interestingly, states vary widely in what's required at the pre-employment phase. States like Ohio have nothing on the books whatsoever. In Georgia, where I work most recently, and I think actually still the requirement is, aside from Georgia Post, but I'll get to that in 1 second. The state requirement is that a physician checks a box on a form in Georgia that says this person is free of any mental health impairments. And I can tell you, when I went to my physical, when I got certified in 2011, the physician didn't ask me any mental health questions. They weren't a mental health provider, and they checked the box, and off I went. In California, they have much more stringent requirements. In California, the psychological evaluation must be done by a psychologist who not only is a licensed psychologist, but also has continuing education in police and public safety psychology. They have the most strict requirements. And like I said, Ohio has no requirements. Maryland does better than some and requires an examination. It does not specify that the individual doing the examination should be a psychologist, and it also doesn't specify that the exam should require a clinical interview. In Georgia, now the Peace Officer Standards and Training has changed the requirement so that a psychologist or a psychiatrist must sign off, but it also doesn't say whether the person needs to be taking valid tests or go through a clinical interview. So oftentimes what's happening is departments, to save money, are having applicants fill out a form online. They're sending it off to be scored. They're never seen by a psychologist. If there are no issues with whatever form that is that they're completing, then the person is permitted to join the department. And they've never met with a psychologist who's familiar with police and public safety or knows what traits and characteristics someone should have to be able to get into the department. So I think that's a huge issue with pre-employment in that it varies so widely across states and across departments. We have with IACP very strict guidelines about how we conduct pre-employment screening and what we're looking for, how we can legally conduct pre-employment, but that's not the case everywhere. And some psychologists are doing this work, some mental health providers who are master's level people who primarily do therapy, and they're simply screening whether or not somebody has a mental health disorder. And quite frankly, most of the people that we evaluate don't have mental health disorders. They just don't have the traits and characteristics that would make them a good police officer. Integrity, for example. A lack of integrity is not a mental health disorder. However, it's a hugely important characteristic for law enforcement. If the person has a lack of integrity, they have low stress tolerance, they have low self-control, they're probably not going to be a good officer. And they're the ones that are going to wind up in the news on the department for excessive use of force and bad judgment. And so it's so important that we're evaluating people at the front end. We know what we're looking for. We're using valid tests. We're using psychologists who are trained in police and public safety psychology. Not only does that help the community, but it also helps the officer. I don't think that when I fail somebody on the psychological, or I don't recommend someone, that I'm causing that person any harm. I'm protecting them from them getting involved in a position with a department that is not a good fit for them and elevates the risk to the community, to the officer, and to the department. One of the other areas that I work in is fitness for duty evaluations. And those are very different from a pre-employment. I get a lot of questions from people about, well, why can't we just do annual evaluations on law enforcement officers? Once somebody is employed at an agency, they have different protections, right? At the pre-employment phase, we are permitted to screen people out for various personality characteristics that are inconsistent with the job. Once someone's been hired, the only time we are permitted to ask medical questions of an employee is when we have reason to believe that there's a mental health impairment. And that's when a fitness for duty comes into play. If we see that someone is showing up late to work, if we see that they are disheveled, we have reason to believe that they have an alcohol issue, they're having increased problems at home, and that's presenting itself at work through increased irritability, anger, those sorts of things. Then we can order them to undergo a psychological fitness for duty evaluation, at which point the psychologist can do testing, a clinical interview, determine if there are any psychological issues that are impairing that person's ability to do their job, and then make some recommendations about how they may be able to get themselves back to work safely while protecting the officer and the department. The Americans with Disability Act is the law that requires us to identify a mental health issue prior to referring someone for a psychological fitness for duty. So like I said, we are not able to ask medical questions of someone once they've been hired unless we have reason to believe that there is an issue. Again, that's why pre-employment is so important. Because if we're not asking those questions at the beginning and then we get them in the door, then we've gotten ourselves into a situation. And I see that a lot with agencies that don't use qualified personnel to screen their candidates. I've gotten officers in a fitness for duty who've just gone through the academy and they've had these significant mental health issues since before they were hired. And so they're not getting caught at the beginning. And that's a real problem. So I think making sure we're doing those pre-employments is so huge. And because you can't do annual fitness for duty evaluations and you can't just send someone for an evaluation just because, officer safety and wellness is very, very important. We have to make sure that once we've gotten the right officers in the door, that we are continuing to foster their development, their emotional health, their emotional wellness, and recognize when they're not doing well. Know when we need to use a fitness for duty evaluation to make sure that we get those people off the street before they cause harm to themselves or someone else. I don't really have a lot more specific things to inform you guys about. I really wanted to take the opportunity to explain pre-employment screening, fitness for duty evaluations, the difference between the two, and why we can't do annual fitness for duty evaluations, but that introducing those officer safety and wellness programs are so important. And I'm starting to do a lot of that psychoeducation in my agencies now. I'm noticing a lot of people really being a lot more receptive to that. I think the culture is changing and we can all help change that culture. So I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. There are questions from the committee right now. I see two. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, make sure that you write question in the chat and I will be sure to put you on the list. We're going to start with Delegate McComas and then the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have had bills in the General Assembly for several years regarding immunity to critical incident groups that would be basically peer-to-peer counseling after a critical incident, let's say a hostage negotiation or the death of a child or a suicide by cop, you know, something that's really horrific, or they're doing an investigation of a brutal murder of a child. It's never seen the light of day. And part of the problem is that the trial lawyers are very concerned about immunity on any type of immunity. But it seems to me that a lot of times a police officer needs to unburden to a fellow police officer because they there's a bond, there's an understanding. So I was wondering if you would advocate for a limited immunity to have peer-to-peer counseling after critical incidents.
Ellen, do you want to take that or you want me to take it? Oh, Ellen, you're on mute.
There we go. I'll say a couple of things and then you can say a couple. My experience in Maryland, and I have a very strong Officer Bill of Rights that really impacts so many things that go on in the Maryland Police Departments. And so they are very cautious about making sure that nothing happens to the immunity of the police officer. So I think you're dealing with that over and above before you really get into the groundwork of what does immunity do for the officers or less immunity do. I think that's an issue, and I'm assuming that's still there. It was for years, to my knowledge, and it's one of the strongest in the country that I've seen, and it really kind of ties everybody's hands. So
Can I just make a quick comment? No, it has been the law enforcement that's wanted this. It's not been so law enforcement supported it and actually came from Harford County, which is my county, that they've wanted it for a number of years, and they've had different sponsors, you know, one being a police officer. I did it for one time, and we just can't get any mojo. And it's not law enforcement that doesn't want it. It's the trial lawyers, because they don't like immunities. If you say immunity, you know, because this is really you know, it's like Alcoholics Anonymous or like Narcotics Anonymous. You know, so it's basically these people understand what this officer's trauma is all about.
Mhm.
So I think that that's the LEOBR is not the culprit. It's the trial lawyers saying, you know, we don't want any immunities, and if we're going to sue, we want to be able to drill down to the.
I guess maybe you misunderstood what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the unions don't want, the Bill of Rights is very strong, and to my knowledge, it's not changed a lot. So, and that will support what the officers need, and will probably be different from what the lawyers want.
Yeah, and in my experience, officers historically have had issues going to the psychologist at the department or EAP because they're concerned that that information is going to get sent right back to their agency. So here in Georgia, we actually have a statewide peer support program. So it's not even just peer support teams within the agency that people can go to and talk to, but officers can go to the statewide peer support team so they can talk to somebody who's not within their department, and that conversation is completely confidential.
Okay, we're going to go now to the vice chair. Where is she?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here. So we just wrapped up, the speaker and Chair Clippinger appointed a police accountability work group that I chaired and some members of this committee were on, and we just made some recommendations to the speaker, and we're proposing some legislation. And one of those recommendations is to your point, Dr. McElroy, the pre-employment screening. We're recommending mental health. We phrased it mental health screenings and assessments upon hiring. So I'm wondering if you could just briefly touch on, this is my first part of my question, touch on like the scope, because you had mentioned once you're hired, you cannot ask questions about an individual's health. So prior to hiring, what's the scope that can be asked? And then the second part of my question is we also recommended periodic mental health assessments by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So I was wondering if either of you could shed some light on how often you think that those type of assessments should be done, annually, every other year, whatever your suggestion is, and what should be included in those assessments if we can't ask for physical health information.
So at the pre-employment phase, you can really ask anything that can be considered relevant to the job. We focus on personality traits and characteristics, psychological disorders, things like integrity, responsibility, really anything that we could consider relevant to the job, we can ask at the pre-hire phase. With regard to periodic screening, that's where the Americans with Disabilities Act comes in. And you really can't ask any questions once someone's been hired that could lead you to discover that they have a mental health impairment. So at that point, asking any kind of mental health questions in an assessment would be somewhat concerning from a legal standpoint. And that's why we say if you're going to do something periodically, it should absolutely be a confidential wellness visit.
Mhm. Yeah. My response to that, Vice Chair, is you raised some good issues. And in addition to what Dr. McElroy is saying, you might want to look at what are called early intervention systems. You got to be careful. Some of them have a few kinks in them that you need to be careful that you don't put the wrong kind of system into place, but they're the kind of systems that are really focused on officer behavior. And when an officer's behavior is starting to raise some questions in the field, their supervisor really addresses that with the officer right at the outset. It doesn't go anyplace else. It's not part of their personnel file or anything. They start talking to the officer and they make decisions. Does this officer need additional training? Does this officer need to be referred for some kind of counseling? Does the officer, would it be peer support be good? They have a number of options that they can choose, but they start to track the officer to make sure that the behavior that they are concerned about, and it's an on-job behavior, starts to change and gets changed, and then the officer is no longer having those issues and they're doing fine, or unless they develop something else. But that's something that many departments are putting in place. But as I said, anytime you put something new in place, you got to take a close look at it. And I think it's the CNA Corporation, which is right there in Arlington, Virginia, which has done a very thorough analysis on the the early intervention systems.
Thank you. That was also one of the recommendations of the work group, was for all departments to implement an early warning system. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Mr.
Early warning. The reason being, initially they were called early warning, and an attorney said to me, never call it early warning. That means you're telling people out there that we've got cops you have to warn you about. So talk about early intervention instead of early warning.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very much. We'll go to Delegate Pippi.
All right, good to see everyone this morning. This is a question probably for Heather related to pre-employment screening. I would imagine that the low-hanging fruit would be as if you had a police applicant that had a history of mental health issues, or let's say run-ins with various agencies, something that they could track, or maybe even a medical history that would indicate such. The bigger problem is when you have someone that has no history of anything related to mental health. And I think our law enforcement folks would agree that, when you're put in an extremely stressful situation, we don't know how they're going to act. And that's what's happening, is that, some of the scenarios were mentioned before. So my question is, how effective is some of this pre-screening, some of the tools or methods that you're using to identify things that have probably never been seen before in these individuals? I mean, how difficult is it to predict how what would be seen as a normal person with a normal history, who's then going to get put into a very scary situation, and how that will impact them? So maybe if you could just elaborate a little bit on that, because I agree that it would be better to catch these things ahead of time. Catching them after the fact, it's too late. You want to catch these things because we want the best and the brightest, entering our law enforcement. So if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, that would help me out. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Scribner was one of the founders of a field of police and public safety psychology. And we've been doing research on the measures that we give to officers, the personality assessment inventory, the California personality inventory, the MMPI, the Inwald battery. So we have developed a lot of personality tests and screening tools that we've then had the opportunity to collect outcome data on. So we've recommended the officer, they've gotten hired. We are able to see how they're performing and how they're responding to critical incidents. And then we tweak our processes so that we're doing a better job hiring in people who we can predict will do well. So for example, on the tests that I use, we can compare how someone performs on those tests. We can compare them to other officers who've been successful on the job for at least a year. So we're continuing to collect that data. In my office right now, we're collecting outcome data from all of our departments so that we can see how people are performing and then continue to adjust that pre-employment process. I think that's a very good question.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any further questions for this panel as I wrestle with the mute button? All right. Seeing no further questions from the committee, thank you both Dr. Scribner, Dr. McElroy. We really do appreciate your spending your time with us this morning and really giving us some greater insight on this issue. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So it's 9:45, and why don't we just keep going? Our second panel, as I mentioned, we're going to hear a briefing on local crisis response teams from 3 different jurisdictions here in Maryland, from Anne Arundel County, from Howard County, and from Baltimore City. We'll do questions and answers after all 3. I may play that by ear here a little bit, depending on how long each one of them goes. That's not making a judgment. That's just, you know, I might break it up a little bit more than that. But let's begin with friends from Anne Arundel County, Lieutenant Thomas, Jennifer Corbett.
Good morning. I'm Steve Thomas. I'm a lieutenant with the county police. I'm a sworn lieutenant, and we're just going to speak about how we have fully integrated the police department and mental health through crisis response. Jen is my partner, and as you see, we're together. We've integrated that much that we present together, and actually at times I think we think alike.
That's true. I'm Jen Corbin. I'm the director of Anne Arundel County Crisis Response, which is under the Mental Health Agency. We've been running mobile crisis since '99. But what we're here to talk to you about today is how we've taken both mobile crisis and what is considered our CIT, crisis intervention teams, and really taken a model and mixed together police and mental health in many different fashions to suit whatever calls for service are before us. So what's kind of unique here is Steve would actually do a lot of the talking about mental health, and I'll do a lot of talk about the police department piece because we really are one, the way we're housed. So I'll kind of let Steve talk about like how things came from the beginning.
So starting in '99, I was a patrolman. Prior to being supervised, we were introduced to our mobile crisis teams. There's 2 mental health clinicians. Generally, one is master's level independently licensed. The easiest way for a lay person to understand that they have the ability to complete an emergency petition. We're on police radio responding to police calls for service where patrolmen believed a mental health intervention was more appropriate than arrest and wanted that extra help. We became close to the clinicians. They attended lineup, and that's the beginning of our relationship. So this isn't something that it was overnight. It's been 21 years in the making. So next slide. So work together. Today, it's the discretion of the officer, again, the call. Mobile crisis teams respond to various issues. This is not all inclusive, but mental health issues, juvenile issues, traumatic events, homelessness, substance abuse, family violence, elderly issues. It's when the officer believes that they could get additional help on a social issue that they call the mobile crisis team. The teams are on police radio, have police call signs. Next, please. So and one of the things that, and I've learned from Jen, is the importance of follow-up. The mobile crisis teams aren't just responding to the initial calls for follow-up, but so over 2,100 calls they responded to with patrol, but they conducted almost 6,000 follow-ups last fiscal year. So the next slide. So this is when we fully integrated, and this was a vision of Jen. She and I, at the time, I was a shift commander on Western Midnights, and we were doing a homeless initiative, helping children, homeless children, in living in an old motor lodge. And at the time, she went to Chief Davis and proposed that we start a peer support and CIT unit together. And that's where the key is, because it created a culture of helping. So with that, we partnered CIT officers, and we'll talk about the training, but the key is that they're officers with the passion to help. At the same time, we started our peer support team, and we'll talk about the training for that as well. Next slide. A key, though, in the fall in service of 2015, Maryland Mental Health First Aid told me that we were the first major department in the nation to train every officer in mental health first aid. Jen and I did most of the classes ourselves. And you'll see a side effect was our use of force dropped 21% between 2014 and 2015. 2014 was the implementation of CIT, which started off with actually Jen and I worked to start it off at the time the department, being a lieutenant, I was not assigned to it not until 2016, but beginning of implementation of having CIT, teaching mental health first aid, our use of force went down 21%. It has stayed that low for the most part, and you'll see the drastic reduction in 2019. Next slide. CIT training, we follow the Memphis model. The key is there is no voluntold going to CIT training. It is completely volunteer. International Chiefs of Police suggest that every officer is trained in mental health first aid as a foundation, and that 20% of your department should be trained in CIT. Right now as a department, I think we're at 17, 18%. CIT International has asked that we suspend all training during the pandemic because the training is not a checkbox. It is very serious training. You have to have that human integration, or really the humanistic side. You have to have that one-on-one contact for the training to be successful. What it does is give the proper tools to the officers with the passion to help. And it's the combination of the passion to help and the training that makes the program successful.
And I think if we listen to our last presenters, this is where it's really important and where my passion comes in. It really is about making the right fit. That officer that can bring something to the table, that's not going to rush through the call, that is there wanting to see the call through, do the follow-up. So we are a department where, yes, everyone is mental health first aid trained. They understand signs and symptoms. They know when to call a mobile team or a CIT team out. But not every officer wants to respond to those calls on a consistent basis. And so we want to make sure that fit is correct. So instead of just rushing through a checkbox, and I've really appreciated our last several chiefs sticking by that we're not going to just check a box and train everyone in 40 hours because it's a checkbox. We're going to put the right people in the training that want to be there. And at the end of the day, that makes our unit stronger. And so that's been a really important thing that I feel our chief has always supported, along with our mental health agency, is getting the right people in there to do it.
Next slide. So the CISM training is really important. So ICISF, the International Critical and Stress Foundation, is actually in, the home is in Ellicott City. It was created by Dr. Jeff Mitchell from UMBC and George Everly from Hopkins. And it's following their leadership, their training, and the procedures there that we're able to help people. And we have actually, at Crisis Response Randall County, we don't just do this for the officers, we do it for the community. But the key is it's 30 hours of training. There's no shortcuts to it. You have to, the training takes that long. I'm an instructor for them. It teaches proper communication of how do you help people in their time of need. The active listening, the reflective listening, the unbiased listening, recognizing emotion to build empathy, get that bond with the person, and then following to procedures. One of the questions from the delegate earlier was about the critical incident stress debriefing. We use these skills after every critical incident, which we'll talk to a little bit more, but we come up with an action plan after every traumatic incident to help the community as well as our officers.
And a really unique piece of this is not only using peer support officers to help officers, but early on with me attending roll calls, I found officers calling me middle of the night the next day after an incident going, hey, can I talk to you? Like, why am I up all night? Why do I not feel right the next day starting my shift? They felt comfortable calling mobile clinicians because we're there with them and in a different capacity, and they could process their feelings. You know, we give out sheets that they can look at things that maybe should not be happening a week out or 2 weeks out, a month out, if they're still having feelings. And their comfort level of being able to reach out is what kind of steered me to, well, let's make sure they know that we're all in this together, which is what led us to developing our peer support, which is unique because it not only has officers in it, but it has some of our mobile crisis as well, so that officers can feel comfortable processing and debriefing with people that they know are on those calls as well.
So and when you look at it, and the doctors earlier talked about all the extent that departments go through in their hiring process, how do you take that 21 or 22-year-old happy-go-lucky kid who becomes a police officer, and in the course of 20 years, they become an angry, nasty, and we've all seen that officer. And it's the thing is, instead of asking what is wrong with you, the same thing we have to ask children who have been exposed to trauma and the citizens exposed to trauma. What have you experienced? What have you been through? And how can I help you with that trauma as we move forward? There's no difference between how you treat officers and how you treat the community. Next slide. So this is where, and I think it's Jen's vision in 2014, when we created both together, is we treat officers the way we expect them to treat the community. Peer support officers are there with clinicians background to help them after all at the time of need after traumatic incidents. And there's no definition of it. You know it when you see it, and it's that incident that shocks your conscience. So professionally, some of the SIDS deaths, youth suicides, fatal accidents. I've been told that we were the first and only mass shooting after the Capitol Gazette to have a comprehensive response that assisted not only the officers, but the community. With that, officers go through their own traumatic incidents in their personal lives, and it's also being there for them. You know, it can be extremely difficult for an officer working midnight shift at 9:30, 10 o'clock. They're in an argument with their significant other, and then 11:30 they're responding to a call for a domestic argument with the same exact argument they were just part of. Or you respond to a SIDS baby death, and your baby is the same age at home. I can tell you the first SIDS baby death I went to in 1999, living in the area, the first thing I did when I left that call was go home to check on my little girl, who's now 22 years old. And they're the ones, and we talk about when it's a clashing of our worlds. Our personal world conflicts with our professional world because there's a relation between the two and how it personally affects you from that call that you've responded to. The next slide, please. So we develop a comprehensive crisis intervention plan after every incident. It's now become routine. It's an expectation. The officers expect us to be there for them, as well as they call us to be there for the community. And it has really created a culture of helping and understanding how we can be there to help each other as a community.
And it's really great because we're able to get communication out. We do a lot of these community debriefs after a situation has occurred. And not only are we helping that community during that situation, but I just did one last week where the next thing you know, I'm at their civic association because they want the neighborhood to know there's resources available, and the trickle effect of helping the community, not just with the incident that may have occurred, but maybe things that are happening elsewhere in their own household that gives them the resource to reach out, call our warm line, ask questions, and get help when they need it. So it's really an important piece that also just gets the information out that there's help there any time of the day when they need it, both from the police department and from our warm line, which is 24/7.
An example, all youth suicides, unfortunately, when we have them in the county, Jen and I respond to every one of them. We had one over the summer where the school system was concerned of one specific 14-year-old friend of the deceased. I made contact with the young lady. We did follow up with her. 3 weeks ago, she sent me a message saying, Mr. Thomas, I know I need help. Can you help me right now? And it's building that relationship with the community, that how many 14-year-old girls are going to reach out to a 52-year-old police lieutenant saying, hey, I know I need help with my mental health right now. Can you send someone out to help me? And we have been back helping her again. Next slide. So the unit is a little bit, everyone with crisis intervention teams is a little bit different based on the individual resources in their community. So the keys are community collaboration among all mental health providers, law enforcement, and working with NAMI and family consumer advocates. The key for our CIT unit is where we partner, Jen and I are partners, and our officers are partnered with clinicians. It's expanding, it's an expansion of our crisis response system. It's just expanding how we have all the different parts that we could go in hours talking about our care coordinators, our mobile crisis teams, and some of it we will hit on in a few minutes. But it's the key that it's the people and the training. It's the people with the passion to help and the training and giving them, what gives them the tools to help. Next slide. So Patrol CIT, we have, I believe right now it's 141 officers trained in CIT. We currently have 4 officers, a sergeant, myself in the unit. As schools are closed, we have an additional 5 SROs who are CIT trained in the unit. But the officers are taught in the training, it is the culture of helping, that They are to recognize the call for service, that their expertise, their passion to help, and they self-deploy to be the leader on that call. And it's become routine for us as a department for that to happen. Next slide. So things that we respond to as a CIT unit, we work with homicide. We respond to all homicides to assist the victim's family, the community. We do community debriefings. And again, we're following the principles of critical incident stress management from ICISF when we do this. We assist the victims' families. Barricades, we're there working with the community. One of our recent barricades, actually one of our clinicians in hospital diversion already had a relationship. They had already been helping the person that was in crisis. That clinician worked hand in hand with our crisis negotiation team to have a successful negotiation. But then we followed it up. We did a community, we call it a crisis management briefing, giving information to the community in their healing. Because think about the effects it has on a family when you're in an apartment complex, there's families being evacuated, and just knowing that's happening in your quiet community, it's a traumatic incident. So we do follow up on every one of those incidents. Next slide, please. So right now, I think we're following about 80 people. But again, it's the follow-up. Our officer clinician teams, the clinicians did last fiscal year 257 mental health assessments, of which 25 EPs were written by the clinician. But the key is we made over 1,300 home visits and another over 8,100 follow-up contacts with the consumers we're working with. Our goal is to work with them that they know we are there as a social support for them. We're there as a resource. And when they're in crisis, they can call us for help. The next slide. So, and some of these things, and I think we've been pretty creative in how can we help people in crisis? How can we help people with mental health issues? So one of the programs that we do, we work with our juvenile coordinator. When a child is charged with an offense, we divert them from the criminal justice system to the behavioral health system. There's certain stipulations, first, second offense, and what they are. But there's only 2% recidivism when we do that, because we're linking that child and that family to the appropriate mental health treatment. We're linking them to resources that'll help them. And it's dealing with the root cause of the problem that's leading to their behavior. Prior to the pandemic, we were meeting with the Board of Ed, the Public Defender, and State's Attorney's Office every month for certain children. So we had a complete community wraparound to help those children who were in the school system as well as in the criminal justice system and the behavioral health system. Whenever someone is emergency petitioned and they go inpatient treatment, if they have charges, instead of sending them traditionally through the criminal justice system, we coordinate with the inpatient facility. Our officers will pick them up. We walk them through the criminal justice system. We've had a great success. To my knowledge, we have not had anyone recharged with an offense. Now, we have had people emergency petition, but that's good because we're getting them, linking them to the treatment that they need. We work hand in hand with our Homeland Security unit on threats. And the key is to have a behavioral health response to it, recognizing the criminal justice system isn't going to be able to help. The emergency department and EPs can be a revolving door, just like the detention center can. But what are we doing for the long term, addressing the root cause that's leading to the threat and assisting them with their grievance that's leading it to it? Our hospital diversion, our all CIT officers work hand in hand with them every day. Whenever someone's EP'd, the officers forward the reports, information, and hospital diversion for complete community follow-up. Our safe stations, anyone in Anne Arundel County can go to a police or firehouse. A clinician will respond, develop an individual treatment plan for that person. We work hand in hand with the state's attorney's office, the public defender's office. We link, as a police officers, we link anyone with criminal issues that does not represent it to the public defender's office. We have warrants recalled, working together with the judges, the public defender, state's attorney, get court dates postponed so that he can attend treatment first. We then will accompany them and take them to court where they have a clear mind and understanding of what they're going through. it really doesn't make sense. If you take them to court where they're in active addiction or active withdrawal, they really don't understand what's going on. We've had great success with safe stations. 75% of the people that come into a safe station go into long-term treatment. Of those, 66% are still sober 90 days out. A side effect, the year before safe stations, we had over 1,900 burglaries in the county. Last year, we had 900. Theft from autos dropped, I believe the numbers were from 4,000 to 3,000. So it has an effect of dropping crime, and we're also saving families. And the clinicians do a great job of linking their social support, but however, they link them back to their pre-existing in the person in sobriety. Frequent pawners, when people are going and pawning a lot of their property, it's either a criminal justice issue or it's a social issue. We reach out and offer them assistance. Next slide, please. So calls from when the mobile crisis team go out and assist officers in patrol, they refer calls to us. The repeat 911 callers who are calling in every night, reach out to them. It frees up patrol, but also we're, again, addressing the root cause of a problem. Assisting victims whose victimization is due to their delusions, mental health concerns, victims who are victims because of mental illness, suspects who are because of mental illness, schools when they need additional assistance, what they need farther from what they can provide themselves. And then we have a 24/7 crisis response warm line where citizens can call in for themselves and family members, and we will respond out and assist them, and we'll do follow-up. So next, please. And
so I think the overall piece of this in talking about referrals and where we're working together really is just about talking about making that connection in the community and really allowing the community members to see police officers in that helping fashion when whether they're in crisis or coming out of crisis, and just linking them to services. And it's very interesting to see in our program where Steve talked about the 24 warm line at the end, more people starting to call in asking to talk with the officer sometimes than the clinician, because they have questions, they need help, they want someone to take them to court or to take them to their appointment. So it's been a really important part of community policing for our county to show that we're all in this together and that we're working together for the betterment.
And as a side note, we also do have a officer wellness program addressing the 5 tenets of the officers' mental well-being, their physical well-being, their family wellness, their financial wellness, and their spiritual wellness.
Okay, what we're going to do is, I think that was a lot of information, a lot of good information. So I am going to break this up a little bit and give people the opportunity to ask questions for each of the individual subdivisions. And for some reason, the delegate from Anne Arundel County wants to ask a question first. Delegate Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve, Jen, I am so happy to see you all. I am so proud of you all and the work that you all are doing and the entire team. I have to say, Jen, my first encounter with you actually was in the community right after the Capitol Gazette shooting, and when we were having the vigil, and I saw these folks in these blue shirts walking around and just asking people, "Are you okay? Are you doing all right?" And I thought, wow, this is pretty cool, because it was it was a community outpour. After, and it was so soon. You all were right there the next day. I wanted to touch on a couple of quick words phrases that I heard: the passion to help people, and also mental health first aid and follow up. Those items are just critical, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate also that you have data to back up your effectiveness. And I wanted to know, I do believe read that you all received a national recognition. Can you talk a little bit about that and what was it for?
So we got recognized from CIT International as International CIT Team of the Year. It is a huge recognition and we appreciate it. Thank you for putting that out there. But, you know, we're always striving to get better though. There's always things that we can work on and things that we're motivated to do. And right now it really is to continue to do as much of that community policing as we can. How do we get people at this time and need to still call for help, right? We want people to call for help. And one of the things I would say that we're starting to see is that with some of that recognition, more use of our warm line instead of 911, where they're calling in here and saying, hey, I don't want an officer, but I think I need something. And then we explain CIT to them. And then they're like, oh, well, yeah, we can have that kind of officer come. And, you know, and so it's that piece of just really educating the community that's really important at this time. And we're trying to get that out as much as possible. But thank you.
And
Well,
one of the
thank
keys,
you.
I think, if you look at our uniforms, this is our daily uniform. They supplement each other. Ours
Right.
is a little bit softer, the softer police side of the bright blue. But it's important that people recognize this together. Part of Jen's vision also wasn't, it goes, a lot of police departments bring mental health to the police department. This is opposite. We've actually taken the police department and implemented it into the mental health system.
Yeah.
And
Which is very important, because what you find is officers have questions, and if they can't find it here, they can walk in the building. You know, there's at any time, there's 5 mobile teams here. There's the warm line. If they've got a question about a note they're reading, they can go over to the warm line and say, hey, did you take a call from this person? And there's that integration that's happening constantly in our building. The person who's in the hospital follow up on EPs, an officer can go over and ask that clinician, what's going on at Anne Arundel Medical Center today? You know, how can I help? So really is about everybody working together in that building. And that has been my vision from the whole time. Is it's not that, don't throw the clinician in the police department, but allow the police department to be more out in the community working. And so that's kind of where we've drawn from.
Well, thank you very much for your work, and thank you for you know, correcting me that you all received international recognition. That's very important. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Hey, Delegate Bartlett being a little shameless there. All right, let's go to, and rightfully so. We have Delegates McComas, Erican, and Grammer. So McComas, Delegate McComas to begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very impressed with the work you all have done. And I just have a brief question. I think you're probably familiar, because it's been on the national news, about the little black young man that was killed in Colorado, who had a history of playing violin to the animals in the shelters. And he said he was an introvert, and anyway, he passed away, unfortunately. And I was wondering if you have some kind of database that if somebody, let's say someone had called on him in Anne Arundel County, and then later, you know, somebody said, hey, there's somebody suspicious walking down the street or whatever. I think they thought he had stolen some food or something from the local convenience store, that you could look it up and you'd see, well, this person's got, you know, kind of some issues, or they have some idiosyncrasies that the police would not have, you know, handled that call the way they did. Do you keep a database, and is that database prevented from being subpoenaed by anyone? In other words, there's confidentiality maintained for that individual's privacy. So if you could answer those questions, I'd appreciate it. And
yeah, so we do work out of 2 databases. So police work out of their CAD system, their report system, and then we work out of an electronic medical health record. So there are 2 databases, and ours is definitely, you know, covered under HIPAA. But what we do now have, it's interesting you ask, is a system that we're using for people who we are working with that want some kind of flag on the police system, so that if there is a call, we can be alerted, 1. And 2, if there's information they would like someone to know, they can write that on the form that they fill out to say, you know, when I'm in crisis, this is what would help. So we are working that. So like in an easy example, I mean, we do it for adults and kids, but on a kid's side is if some parent is concerned about their child with autism, it might say, notes might say, call CIT or call a mobile team, but please respond without sirens or without lights because of the noise. Or when you enter, you know, my kid likes music, if you can really, like, key points that we can use. So we are allowing families and people with mental health to now put flagging in. We also do alert when the client signs a release. So we get releases signed right up front for police, fire, certain agencies. And then that allows us to put in there, when called on this individual, please radio for a CIT or mobile team to respond with you. Those are the things that we're doing to kind of help the officers not get into a situation. They will already know en route that help's coming, versus getting there as a police officer, assessing the scene, and then calling for a team to start. If we know ahead that that's what we need, we're just going to start that en route at the same time.
And actually, as officers, myself and all the officers sign confidentiality agreements with the mental health agency. We write more mental health reports and notes, probably 100 to 1, than we do police reports. But with that, it can become difficult, but we never have problems with the police department when a superior in the police department will ask us a question and there's not a release, when we say, I'm sorry, sir, I can't tell you that information. Because we are bound by HIPAA based on that confidentiality agreement that we sign with the mental health agency. And ma'am, if I can, one comment, just so you know, when we started back in 2014, Lieutenant Junkerman was one of the first that we spoke to from Harford County that has been a great friend, ally. And at the Capitol Gazette, the night of the shooting, I called Mark at 11 p.m. and said, Mark, I need your help tomorrow morning. And he said, what do you need? I said, I don't know, but I just know I need you. And he's been a great ally of ours and a great friend and great partner.
And he was the one that asked to put that bill in initially, too.
Yes, ma'am.
One quick follow-up question. Can your records be subpoenaed by lawyers?
I would imagine, yes. And then what happens is the officers' records that are in our system go to their department. We only release to them, and then they release their records how they see fit, if that makes sense. So, because some officers are putting notes in our system, they're not ours to own. They actually go back to the police department to be released.
Well, let's say that there was a case and the person whose records is still alive and they don't want those records released. This is the individual that you all held. They're given an opportunity to oppose the release prior to release, because
yes, and that all goes to our headquarters to be dealt with. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We're going to go to Delegate Arakan, then Grammer, then Delegate Conaway. Just a reminder to the committee, we do have 2 more jurisdictions who are going to present, so we're going to try and keep moving a little bit here. But Delegate Arakan.
Hi, guys. Mine's quick. So great work. And what other counties, if you know, have a similar setup? I would love to know sort of where we're at statewide with having this kind of CIT response setup. Thanks.
So I think every jurisdiction does CIT based on the resources in their own jurisdiction. I don't know if any jurisdiction is fully integrated and part of the crisis system to the degree we are, but each one, I do work hand in hand at times with Baltimore County, but I know that they do have the officer clinician responding to initial calls for service like our mobile crisis teams do. But I'm not sure of anyone that is fully embedded to the degree that we are.
We're helping a few of the counties get to that point. Several have come out and shadowed our system and are working towards it. And I think one of the things that we have to work towards, and it's great to see everybody here and talking about jurisdictions, and I think the other 2 that are talking will say the same thing, is we're really in the last year breaking down barriers of borders, and that, if something's happening that's crossing a jurisdiction, we're working together, and I'll just speak like Howard County. If something's over there, we're working together on that piece as it's happening. If the individual is at our hospital but is going back to their county, we're going to work together on that. And so we have really built where CIT is located. We have really worked with all of our partners in different jurisdictions with that. Because one of our big things is, if it's an Anne Arundel County resident, right now they're in Baltimore County, it's still my responsibility to make sure they're getting the services they need. It's not Baltimore County's job. If they're in treatment somewhere or they're in an inpatient facility, it is my responsibility to make sure that happens. And so we need everybody to get on that same mindset and not say, well, right now they're in your county, they're your responsibility. So we're all really been working last year, 6 months on saying, how can we do this so that we can all kind of work together, if that makes sense.
Let's go to Delegate Grammer.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for what you do. Brief question. It seems like a lot of what you do is about exposure to the community. And that exposure to the communities helped create good relationships. So what I wanted to ask was, there's a lot of discussion about police interactions and how to improve relationships. So I wanted to see if you can comment on your exposure to the community prior to kind of a crisis situation, the benefits of that, if you see any negatives, and what we should take away from those interactions. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the big things for us in CIT is the fact that we do a lot of stuff pre-crisis. So especially, I'll just use an example of our kids program. We've done a soapbox derby. We did a whole summer camp where we took school calls for service the prior year. And we reached out to all the families and offered them a week where they could register their child to be partnered with an officer, and our clinicians ran a camp. And so we have seen really positive effects from those. I mean, officers picked them up, brought them to camp all week. We had pet therapy. They went to the aquarium. They did trust building exercises. Through that next year after that camp, when something was happening, those kids were actually calling their officers for help. And their ability to remain in school and their ability to reach out for help when they were in crisis helped. There were no incidents with any of the 10 children that partake that next year in school. It builds that rapport. So we started noticing that if we got out and did those things more often, we did a fun where we did fire versus police and soapbox derby, and they each had a kid and they built their soapbox. All of these things to mentor, to allow there to be that positive interaction. Because when you're doing that, then kids are talking, then the community's talking, and then the next thing you know, that's building a bigger block of community policing and saying, hey, it's not so bad. You need to meet this officer. He can help you too. Kids talking, parents talking. So we have seen a real positive effect with a lot of the things that we're doing out in the community. Also just being at events, having a table set up and having conversations with families, whatever it might be. Now that's, COVID's really hit us hard this year, but that's what we were doing pre-COVID.
And there are people that are called the police side of CIT, the Hug Squad, but it really has an important role because when people are in their time of need and you're there providing them support and giving them that hug if they need it, it creates the relationship. Unfortunately, yesterday we were at the funeral of a 16-year-old victim of a homicide, and the father actually stopped the service to thank us for being there in front of 50 kids. And it's that being there at someone's time of need builds on that relationship. When they need us, we're there, and then they remember that. And again, they talk about it within their families.
All right, Delegate Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, do you have a list of traumas, and maybe they're listed by something called life change units or credits? I learned about that when I was in college. And I was wondering, what is a delusion? What do you consider to be a delusion? And the last point I wanted to ask about is if someone in the community calls and says, hey, there's a guy playing the violin over there to the squirrels, does that seem like the person needs an emergency petition, or would they ask him, what are you doing? Or are you practicing, trying to become better so you can do a concert, or how would that be handled?
Well, it's funny, and I'm gonna take that one first, is that we respond, and that's really the key. You know, people think just because something seems unnatural to them that it's immediately an emergency petition, versus exactly what you said. when those calls come in, 911, if it's 911, then they're saying, hey, we're going to send someone out, and then mobile goes out. And no, we're not going to EP. We're going to talk and educate that some people have a right to have mental health and to do things that might seem out of the ordinary. 1, 2, we're going to encourage them to see if they want to work with us on anything that they feel they need. Now, playing a violin to a squirrel might be their way of coping. And we're going to say, okay, this is where you are. Now let's talk about the people who care, that seem concerned about you. And it really is just a conversation. It starts so that we can then follow up. It might be a call the next day. How are you doing today? Because really, what is that problem that's having someone call in, and finding out and letting them know someone called in? That's the key. When you start, I always, even when I'm doing CIT training, one of the things we talk about is when you arrive on the call is letting them know someone cared enough about you today to call. Okay. And then say, that's really cool. And then go into what the person's concern was that called in for the service. But we need to start not walking in saying, you know, what's wrong? Why are you doing this? But coming in with the mindset of, and that's what we do a lot in our CIT training, is think about why the call came in. En route, what are you going to do during that call? And then when you arrive and you see what it is, starting out with that caring piece, because that's really important. The fact that someone calls 911, we forget this sometimes. Or if someone calls on themselves, they want help. We need to get back in that mindset, not still having the protective piece, but remembering that piece. So a lot of our training is in that initial, how do you show up to the call? How do you tell them this call was generated to start it?
And an example of delusion is something that has changed over the years, but the person that is calling 911 because when you get to their house, there's aluminum foil on every wall because they're concerned because the Martians are putting x-rays through their walls, affecting and putting voices in their head. So 30 years ago, officers would sit and take aluminum foil and make them a hat and say, here, wear this hat and it'll protect you. Now it's knowing to call the mobile team out, call a mobile crisis team out. And, you know, it's most calls are not an emergency petition. And it's only taken, the emergency petition is only when they are a danger to themselves or others, like Jen said. It's not just because they have a mental health concern, but that's the simplest delusion is something like that where, and I'm sure our Howard County partners have the same thing, that NSA is sending out radio waves to take over their minds and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for speaking to us today. I'm having a brain fart this morning. I apologize, but we'll go now to the group from Howard County. The vice chair can there you go. We'll hear from Sergeant Arlovsky, Officer Holloway, and Dr. Mariana Israelson, who will talk to us about how they do this in Howard County.
Good morning. I'm Sergeant Mark Orlowski. I am the supervisor of Howard County's mental health section. Our section is responsible for providing direct outreach and resources to the citizens of Howard County, as well as providing mental health training to our officers. Our section has existed as a section since 2018. But prior to that, we had mental health liaisons embedded in our community outreach division since 2016. My counterpart, Officer Holloway, was actually our first mental health liaison in the department, and I'm going to hand it off to her to discuss in a little bit more detail about what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Good morning, everyone. Again, we are very happy to be here. And as Sergeant Orlowski said, I want to give you guys, just a little bit of a picture about, sort of the full departmental integration of what we do with the mental health section. As he stated, we've always had a really good relationship with our civilian clinicians. We've had a civilian clinician embedded in the department since about 2013. And then after the Columbia Mall shooting, the chief at the time recognized that there was a greater need to get sworn officers involved in the process as well. And so in 2016, I became the first mental health liaison. And they handed me a job description. And within the first 3 days, I took it back to them and I said, this is not what this job is, because it was something so brand new. And so I've been very, very lucky to be able to, be part of not just the beginning of that role as the mental health liaison, but to see it grow. And now we're a section of 3 sworn officers, including my supervisor, Sergeant Olaski, and we still have that one civilian clinician that's embedded with us. Just a little bit about what we do. Our basic job tenet is to read and review each emergency petition that an officer conducts. And for us, it's about 1,500 a year. And then the hospital also has walk-ins and things like that that we're not part of. So as a county, we're handling quite a few calls for service, every day that involves someone, with a mental health crisis. What follow-up means for us is, we're trying to encourage future help-seeking behavior and facilitate more community-based resolutions. Immediate follow-up for acute cases, these are things these are usually not emails, these are usually phone calls for, we'll get a call from a watch commander, someone has a weapon, there's threats of weapons. There may need to be an extreme risk protective order, which our unit also deals with. These are things that need acute follow-up, they need attention immediately. Those intermediate follow-ups for more moderate cases, and I believe that these are sort of the bulk of what we get. These are our repeated callers. Incidents that may involve a paired criminal offense, as Lieutenant Thomas said, paired criminal offense with an incident that has a mental health component, or those opportunities where, we may need to facilitate, with getting someone back into treatment or hooking them up to treatment just to start. These can be done, in phone calls, in person, by making contact at our local, community-based providers. And then there's a low level of follow-up. One of the things that I thought was really important, especially when it was just me sort of doing the work along with the clinician, is that I always felt like I had to choose who I helped. And I should also mention, I've been a police officer for 20 years, but I'm halfway through a master's degree in macro level social work. So I work well in systems and how to maximize efficiency. And I just felt like, as one person, how do I help 1,500 people a year? And so what I did was adapt an outreach letter, because we know that not every person who has, gone through an emergency petition is going to come back. A lot of our EPs are single time events. And we really want to meet people where they're at. And so we developed a mental health outreach letter. It has a QR code on it that people can scan, and that takes them right to our digital pamphlet. So we put that, opportunity to follow up on their own in their hands. And obviously our contact information is on that letter as well. But what that picture does with this immediate, sort of intermediate and low level follow-up, it allows us to have almost 100% follow-up. So we no longer are caught in this position where we're picking and choosing who gets the most of our resources. We've really been able to maximize through efficiency and use of systems, getting help to everyone. We also conduct all of our in-service and recruit level mental health training, which is the following slide. Conduct routine policy review. And again, as a systems person, this is an area that I've really been able to dig into quite a bit, because this landscape of how policing and mental health relate is ever changing. Over the past 20 years, when I first started as an officer, if you had 6 emergency petitions a month as a squad, it was busy. And now we have squads that are doing 6 a day. So, looking at how we're responding in the community, how, we're training our officers, has changed over those 2 decades. I'm also one of the CIT coordinators for our agency, along with my civilian counterpart. And we sit on the state committee, and that's been really, because that not only impacts things that happen in my agency, but it allows us to look as a state about how, I know the delegate asked a question about, other counties that are participating in this. And this state CIT coordinators committee is really the opportunity for us to look at how the state of Maryland is responding and adapting, and based upon all its corners and various needs of the jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So with the training, our training has also evolved. Our recruit officers receive 12 hours of mental health training. I recently was able to get 4 additional hours for a block on trauma-informed policing, which is a curriculum that I wrote that I'm exceptionally proud of. And we've talked a lot about, sort of officer wellness and, the psychological impacts that an officer may experience throughout their career. And a lot of times that's delivered in standard self-care, stress management, and things like that. And what I've found is that sometimes that's like putting cheese on broccoli, and is that we know that they know that they need to eat broccoli, but they just don't really like it. And so we cover it with cheese. And the trauma-informed policing curriculum helps our officers understand the impact of trauma, whether it be acute trauma, consistent trauma, generational trauma, historical trauma. It helps our officers understand people's reactions and responses, and that they may have exaggerated responses, they may be escalated, and how to understand that from a trauma-informed lens. The benefit with that is that these impacts of trauma are universal. It's not like I need to have a separate curriculum for how trauma impacts a civilian or how trauma impacts a police officer. So what we found by integrating this trauma-informed policing curriculum into the recruit level training and the CIT school is that we're getting more cops that are not only more patient and more empathic with people out on the road, but they are more patient and empathic and aware of what's happening with them as well. So the trauma-informed policing curriculum, getting it into the recruit level, I've been really proud of being able to do that. After that, each officer receives training every other year on a mental health refresher. And these are just going over those sort of, big nuggets of training, how to respond to people in crisis, best practices, changes in policy and procedure, things like that. We are an agency that has decided that we're going to go with 100% of our CIT officers certified. And the theory behind that is that not everyone's going to dig into it and really love it. And but what we want to do is raise the floor. We really want to bump up all the level of training. And we know that we're going to catch some in the net that are really, really good at it, and they're going to run with it. We're sitting at a little bit more than half of our agency being certified right now. And I won't go too much into CIT, what that training is. Anne Arundel County did a great job of that. 40 hours of advanced mental health training, de-escalation signs and symptoms, and again, that trauma-informed policing curriculum. Another thing that we've done is look at our partnership and how we work within the community. And I believe Jen said the same thing, is that what we don't want to do is just have our community partners come in and train us, is that we feel like there's a relationship with training. And so we've partnered with NAMI. We've done presentations at their local parent support groups on, what happens when my kid is EP'd, what's an ERPO. I worked with Humanum in their teen group about, safer practices in the community and, how to build better relationships with officers. We've worked with the school system on several different types of training, and they actually asked to have that trauma-informed policing curriculum adapted to trauma-informed classrooms, because we know that there's such a link between discipline that happens in the school and then, potentially the behaviors also being seen in the community. A way station, NASW, we've done presentations with them. Basically, what we're trying to do is just build better bridges, because one of the things that causes the most conflict is repeated silos in our community. And a lot of that is just built around language. We just don't both all speak the same language. And so understanding what each of our roles are, our limitations, and where we have opportunities to grow has been a really big growth spot for this section. Next slide, please. And the final thing we'll talk about is sort of the meat and potatoes about, I think, what everyone likes to hear about is what happens on the road. So the resources that are available to our patrol officers. So prior, and I took this sort of in a 3-tiered approach. So prior to dispatch, so dispatch receives a call from someone, but before it's dispatched to an officer, intervention starts. If you look at the, sort of SAMHSA sequential intercept model, this is, we want to get back to as far back as we can to figure out where we can start intervention. And so we have had CIT trained dispatchers for a long time. As long as we've had a CIT program, we've had CIT trained dispatchers, and they're really able to start that de-escalation almost immediately, trying to navigate and get good information for us, and knowing what an officer may need with that CIT training really helps them ask really poignant and direct questions and get that information that that officer is really going to need to help solve that mental health issue. Another program that I'm really proud to say is that we are in the piloting stage of a program called CIRC, and that stands for Communications Initiated Referral to Crisis. This has been in the evolution for a while, but it's really come up recently in a lot of national conversation about how police respond to calls for service and whether there really is a need for police to respond to a lot of these types of calls. We know that 911, even though everyone has the best efforts of establishing hotlines and 211 and things like that, sometimes it's tough to catch on, and 911 is still the number of people know to call for help. And so, but we know that the response isn't always, I didn't know that I'd get 3 officers at my door, or that's just not really what I wanted, but that's really all that was available. And so what we've done is develop a system where we are able to vet specific calls, and with that person's permission, we're going to go ahead and help refer them to our grassroots crisis hotline. And get people, and that's really just getting them the care that they need at the time when they need it. Obviously, if they want an officer to respond, that call just go ahead and gets dispatched in the normal way. But we're following a lot of these models and saying, getting people the more appropriate level of care at the most appropriate time. On scene, so when an officer does get dispatched, they have a couple different options. Once they get there, they recognize that there might be a mental health concern. They can go ahead and ask for a CIT trained officer. If they feel like their sort of basic mental health training, they need a little bit of help, they can call for a CIT trained officer. It's honestly a little rare for there to be a call where there's not a CIT trained officer, because we have such a large bulk of officers available. If the call then exceeds beyond, or they think they would benefit from a little bit extra clinical help, we too have mobile crisis team that are available to us. We do not pair. However, our mobile crisis team is actually mobile. So they're stationed in 2 different parts of the county. They're a pair of clinicians, or one does carry clinical licensure, and they respond throughout the county. They have a police radio, and they respond to our requests. They also function in the community on their own, and you'll hear a little bit about that in a second. But the mobile crisis team is really, one of our biggest assets to help, distinguish between those calls where an officer just might not be sure whether an EP is needed. Mobile crisis team comes in and gives the opportunity to safety plan. If they too determine that there's an issue that does need to be addressed at the hospital, they accompany our officers down to the hospital, complete the emergency petition there. And they too are responsible for a ton of different follow-up. They're one of my go-to partners in everything that I do. They've helped me develop a bunch of different trainings. I partner with them on trainings all the time. And so, we function, very, very closely with our mobile crisis team. And then our grassroots counselors. So our mobile crisis team isn't 24 hours yet, but they still have the resources to be able to help our officers 24 hours a day. I actually have gotten, and this has also been slow to catch on, but I recently got 2 reports where our midnight shift officers didn't have access to mobile crisis, but they called the grassroots hotline and asked for advice, and they were able to come up with a plan. So I was just so proud in that moment to know that these things are starting to catch on. They're utilizing those resources that are available to them. After the call, we have a mental health resources pamphlet. Those are provided to officers. Anyone who's an officer in the state of Maryland knows that the state of Maryland has many, many pamphlets. And so what we've done is that once officers go through CIT school, I will give them the QR code and they take a picture of it on their phone. And so on that call, they can say, hey, scan this code, and it'll take you right to the digital mental health resources pamphlet. We find that sometimes hand pamphlets, they go in a drawer or they get thrown away. So we like to have multiple avenues so people can follow that up. Handle with care. Jen also mentioned about 911 flagging. Handle with Care is a statewide program, and it allows our officers, if they respond to a scene where there's a youth who may have witnessed either their parent being taken for an emergency petition, or someone in their family, or there was an event where they feel there could be something that the youth may take with them to school the next day. Handle with Care allows our officers to send an email just with that youth's name and what school they attend and no further details. But that just gives the school a heads up to say, hey, if something comes up, a discipline problem, an emotional problem, there was an event, and that event could be linked to this behavior. We know things don't happen in a vacuum, and our youth will take that with them. And then 911 flagging. Our 911 flagging program also started off sort of rooted in, IDD, cognitive impairment, autism spectrum, to allow parents and caregivers the opportunity to put those little bits of information that are really helpful to officers who are responding. Scared of dogs, scared of loud noises, flashlights, sirens, things like that, to help us have a more compassionate response on scene. We've recently opened that up to mental health as well. And this allows the person themselves or a caregiver who's legally responsible for that person to voluntarily provide information that would make that call safer for everyone involved. If you think about someone who has experiencing PTSD, loud sirens, bright lights, things like that can not only be emotionally triggering, but very physically triggering as well. And so 911 flagging system is also things that we can follow up with after the call. That's the last slide I have. I do want to be respectful of the time. So we'll be happy to answer any other questions. And I do want to turn it over to my sergeant, Sergeant Orlowski, to see if he has anything else he'd like to follow up on.
I think Megan pretty much covered everything. Like she said, to be respectful of time. I know everyone has a lot of things to do. We can take questions now, or we can do it after Grassroots does their presentation.
All right, we have Grassroots as well. Why don't we hear from Grassroots, and then we will take questions, and then we will go to Baltimore City. Dr. Israelson.
Good morning. Thank you everybody for having us. I'm very excited to be here. We are, just a little background, Grassroots is a crisis intervention center. We are open 24/7 to serve individuals, families for behavioral health, crisis, and homeless services. We serve as the point of entry for Howard County for housing and homeless services. We provide the Maryland Crisis Hotline. We're part of 211 for mental health and substance use disorders, as well as the Lifeline National Suicide Prevention Hotline for crisis calls. We also have, as you heard before, the mobile crisis team for Howard County. What is ideal about our program and unique is that we provide 24-hour crisis in which any individual in the county or anywhere the calls come from can receive assistance by a counselor immediately. We provide all these services. We are accredited by the American Association of Suicidology as well as the International Council for Helplines. We have counselors helping 24/7 anytime. And what is beautiful about this program is that we can deploy the mobile crisis team from any. So sometimes some calls come directly to our crisis center, and the crisis counselors call the mobile crisis team to respond to those calls. Sometimes we receive the calls directly from the school system. So we partner well with the organizations and community and public health that we can respond to crisis from many different angles, supporting the police department. And we have a radio, as you heard, so we can help each other. And when we respond to a call, we inform the police department, we're going someplace, we need your support, and sometimes we don't. And so it's a really strong partnership and a very way to work together, because it allows for the community to reach out to us where they know they're going to receive relief. Our statistics are very impressive. 99% of the individuals that call the hotline report after a follow-up that their crisis was resolved. We do a lot of follow-up work to make sure that individuals were connected to resources, receive the care that they need, connected to inpatient, outpatient. We also have a 23-hour, 24-hour stabilization crisis center for individuals who suffer with stimulants use disorder and opiate use disorder. So individuals in crisis can come to Grassroots, be with us for 1 to 3 days until we can place them in the appropriate treatment and level of care. So we are the point of entry for Howard County to respond to crisis situations, as well as support the police department with any time of need for the mobile crisis team. We have a wonderful relationship with the police department. I cannot tell you how proud we are, how well we work with them. And without them, our work would be significantly different and much more difficult. I would like to pass on the presentation to our Director of Crisis and Clinical Services, Sarah Smalley, who will talk to you directly about the mobile crisis team basics.
Thanks, Mariana. Good morning. Like Mariana said, I'm the Director of Clinical and Crisis Services for Grassroots. Just some basics about our mobile crisis team. We're available daily from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. We have at least one fully licensed clinician. Most of the time it's 2 fully licensed clinicians that go out. They're either LCSWs or LCPCs, so they do have the ability to emergency petition if necessary. Hopefully that doesn't become necessary during the course of a call, but if it does, then they do have that ability. During the day, the second person on the team isn't required to be licensed. We do prefer that, but if they are not, then the minimum requirement is a bachelor's level and a certain level of expertise and experience in the area of mental health. Like both Officer Holloway and Mariana said, we work really closely with the Howard County Police Department, particularly the Mental Health Liaison's Office, who we are so grateful for our relationship with them. We would not be able to do what we do without the cooperation that we have. In fact, we even managed to persuade them to do some training with us for all the clinicians in Howard County about extreme risk protective orders when they were first authorized last year. So we're really grateful for that we could educate some of the clinicians in the community about that. We meet face to face with people. When we go out into the community, we're dispatched either by police radio or by our hotline, and we do go out and meet face to face with people. Next slide, please. So the success for this team is really defined by safety. How do we keep people safe? And what we really try to do is sort of a different tiered response. We try to safety plan as much as possible. If the person is comfortable with that, if we're comfortable with that, if the significant others around the person are comfortable with that, then we really try to safety plan and come up with something that does not involve hospitalization. Over 84% of our interventions result in community-based resolution and do not need hospitalization. And that's an average over 4 years. And we EP, it's really less, around 15% of the clients that we see, and that's between the police and MCT. So that includes all of the EPs where MCT and the police are involved together. And like Megan talked about, the Howard County Police are becoming trained in CIT. We participate in that training, and we love doing that training. It's very rewarding. We get to see a lot of what happens on the other side of the coin. So we're really grateful to be a part of that as part of the training and part of the role plays that we do with the officers who are going through CIT school. Next slide, please. And this is just some of our statistics for the last few fiscal years. As you can see, we have 882 calls the first year to 721 in fiscal year 20, which was affected obviously by COVID for the last 3 to 4 months of the fiscal year. The number of people served includes people who are around the client, the friends, family members, school staff, agency staff, anything like that. We do also respond to large-scale community events like the Columbia Mall shooting, like the Ellicott City flooding. We provide some of that debriefing to either people who are directly affected, the victims of whatever the large-scale event was, and also the people who are were working. So we did some work, some debriefing with some of the people who were working at the Ellicott City flooding on the cleanup, just to provide that for them too. So I think that's my last slide. Yes.
Okay, I think that's everyone from Howard County. I think that's right. I see one question so far from Delegate Carden. If there are further questions for the Howard County group, please indicate that in the chat. I see also, for some reason, the Vice Chair and Delegate from Howard County has a question. Delegate Carden to begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Officer Holloway and everybody else for the very comprehensive report. Actually, you answered most of my questions while you were speaking, because I asked the question early, but you didn't. There was one thing that, and I'm very excited to see how you work along with with the mobile unit and how seriously they take their jobs. It's really great to see. It's refreshing. How often do you work with hospitals and other healthcare practitioners that you're not affiliated with directly, especially when it's not necessarily an emergency type, or there's no type of issue with people possibly hurting themselves or other people? Because it would seem to me that even though you have both the professionalism and the training to be able to handle these, it would seem to me that there would be some questions of reduced cost and improved results if we also got the institutions that are geared towards doing this as their livelihood to be involved.
Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Delegate, for that question. That you actually asked sort of a multi-layered question. And as a student at the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, I think that seeing how my job has evolved, I think there's an untapped wealth of people that could serve in this intermediate sort of not police, but not quite psychologist level. I think there's a possibility of growing that field tremendously, through training and things like that. I really do think that that's an excellent stepping stone to fill in exactly what you were talking about. The first part of the question, how often do we work with community-based partners? And that goes back to that first slide with that intermediate follow-up. It really is the bulk of what we do. And we do, sort of these careful dances with HIPAA to be respectful of everyone's privacy and things like that. And police play a very odd role, and we get to sort of see things and report things that otherwise we might not have access to. And so we do reach out whenever there's, and these are the reports that come to us primarily after the fact. We read and review and see where there's an opportunity to reconnect someone. A lot of times, in that emergency petition, they'll be under the care of someone. We know that they attend Way Station. We just say, hey, there's an opportunity for follow-up here. This client, says they receive care from you, and we really rely on our community partners to help facilitate that. So part of our goal is to make the system work more efficiently for everyone, and that involves getting everyone involved instead of just assuming they went to the hospital. I'm sure they'll call their provider. I'm sure they'll follow up with what the hospital said. So it really is getting the whole team involved, because this isn't one of those situations, where 1 + 1 = 2. This is 1 + 1 can equal 10 if we're all working together on the same page.
And I do want to add that we have a strong relationship with the other partners in the community. So when we respond, also our crisis hotline actually serves as an emergency hotline in the evenings for many OMHCs in the community. So we are very much working in partnership. Therefore, when we serve a client that we know, we always ask, these are questions that we ask. We follow up with the provider. We tell them what is going on. How are we partnering? What is the situation with the person? And we work in collaboration with the provider to determine the best placement and level of care for that client that we're serving at that particular time. So there is a lot of collaboration behind the scenes that happen to assure. What we also see is that sometimes we go and see an individual and that individual is not connected to care. So our priority is to connect that individual to care. We have a partnership with Shepherd Parade, and that they have spots available throughout, emergency spots available throughout the day. So therefore, we can connect that individual within 1 to 2 days to see a clinician, to see a psychiatrist, to make sure that the care that they need is continuous. But the partnership works behind the scenes extremely well.
Okay, let's go to the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I made up a question just so I could really thank all of these wonderful people here from Howard County for being here. I want to thank Officer Holloway, Sergeant Orlowski. Of course, for those of you who aren't familiar with Grassroots in Howard County, it is a critical part of our county. They do amazing work. So I want to thank Ms. Smoley for being here and Dr. Israelison for being here as well. I was wondering, one, I want to congratulate the police department. I think aiming for the 100% on the training is fantastic. I liked your comments about how, you're just casting that net and then some folks will really gravitate towards that training. So I think that's good. I also like the QR code, because that stuff does end up in the drawer. I wondered if you, either Grassroots or the police department, could just talk about the types of calls that you've received during the pandemic, increases in calls, any types of changes in calls, or increase in a particular area. And if you could just share that with the committee, I would appreciate that.
Absolutely. I think Sarah would be the best person to answer that question because she looks at the numbers and statistics. But we, as a general answer, we have seen 50% increase on the calls for our crisis hotline center since the pandemic started. Sarah, you want to go into more details?
Sure. We saw for MCT in particular, we saw an initial decrease because, everybody was staying in. People were kind of, afraid to interact with anyone on any level when it came to face-to-face. But as we have seen in the last several months, our numbers have gone up to above. They're higher than what they were pre-pandemic. And so we're seeing a lot more calls these days for MCT and for our hotline in general.
Specific types, you would say?
Not that are different from pre-pandemic. I think that pre-pandemic we had many more school calls, but now that schools are not in session, we're not getting those calls. Obviously, we still get a few from teachers and counselors who are concerned about individual students, but we're getting a lot more community calls than we did before because we're getting more calls and we're not getting as many school calls, which means that they're all community calls at this point.
Yeah, and what I have seen on our numbers have been behavioral health calls have increased drastically. So, for example, the calls for our 23-hour crisis stabilization for opioid use disorders and stimulant use disorders have increased as well. People are feeling very isolated. People are feeling and staying at home. So we have seen a lot of calls from family members seeking help.
You mentioned the students, so the students aren't in school. Are you receiving more calls from parents and teachers concerned about students from things that they noticed, online or I don't know, perhaps parents contact teachers and then they contact you? Have you seen an increase in that?
I'd say it's probably about the same number that we were seeing before. I don't think that there has been an increase in, concerned citizens about anything online. I think that we saw, a certain number before, and we're still seeing that number now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you again to all the fantastic people from Howard County for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I think we are ready to move on to Edgar Wiggins from Baltimore City to talk to us a little bit about what is going on there. We'll take questions for him immediately after he is finished, and then we'll move on to a presentation about GBRICS. Thank you very much. Go right ahead.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here and speak to you all today about our crisis organization in Baltimore City. And I have to say, it's nice to see Jen and Steve and Megan and have it not be at a conference, because typically that's only when we see each other. So the way that I am going to make my remarks is that I'm first going to talk to you about the organization's model. And then I'm going to talk about our relationship with the BPD. And I have to start out with my disclaimer, that is that because of the federal consent decree, a lot is changing in terms of Baltimore City, the police department, the way that they provide services, and of course, the way that we interact with them. So I am the founding executive director of Baltimore Crisis Response, Inc., affectionately known as BCRI. And what that means is that I have been in my job for over 28 years. So I essentially know where all the bodies are buried. I can tell you when we got money, I can tell you when funding was cut and all that kind of good stuff. But what we are is a private nonprofit organization that provides a full range of behavioral health crisis services. And I'm just going to run through them quickly. We, of course, have a 24-hour crisis hotline that takes local calls, that gets calls transferred from 211, but like Grassroots is also part of the suicide prevention lifeline network of crisis hotline services. So Everything that comes into us essentially starts with a hotline call. Our mobile crisis teams, and we have mobile crisis teams that work 24 hours a day, every day of the year, consist of two people. They are two mental health professionals. One is a licensed mental health professional, and the other is a health professional, and that is a registered nurse. These are the folks that respond to calls for service in Baltimore City. Pre-COVID, we were averaging about 2,700 calls for service a year. The thing that I think is interesting about that is you're talking about Baltimore City with the dubious distinction of, a lot of violent crime, addictions, and so forth. But our teams went into people's homes, met people on street corners, worked with homeless shelters, and we also received a significant number of referrals from hospital emergency departments who are trying to, rather than admit someone to an inpatient unit, divert them to one of our residential services. So that's our mobile crisis team. Now, the other thing I should add is that often people say, well, why do you have a nurse? Think about the demographics of Baltimore City. Think about the significant number of people that have chronic and acute medical conditions. And also because we get referrals from hospitals, it's important for our nursing staff to be able to go into that hospital emergency department, pick up a medical chart, and know what they're looking at. Because I can tell you, I would not. So that's really important, because one of the things that we have to determine is whether or not we can safely admit someone to one of our residential treatment programs. If there's a concerning somatic condition, our nurse is able to get on the phone, call our doc, and then discuss the case, and we can determine whether or not we can safely admit the person. So that's our mobile crisis team. We have two residential services that we operate. I'm going to talk about pre-COVID. Because of COVID, we have had to change how we house people, how we admit people. Pre-COVID, we had two people in a room. We don't do that anymore because, of course, like everybody else, we're concerned about, mitigating, eliminating the spread of COVID. But historically, we've had 21 what we call mental health crisis beds. These are crisis stabilization beds. And essentially what this means is that people can come in, get a thorough evaluation by one of our psychiatrists, and then have a treatment plan developed with the licensed clinicians that we have on duty, and the person would be admitted. Now, one of the things that I'm very proud of is that anyone that's admitted to a crisis bed at BCRI is seen by a psychiatrist every day. In addition to being seen by a psychiatrist every day, we also have round-the-clock nursing care, because that's important. Nurses are able to check vitals based on the doctor's order. But the other thing, back to medical conditions, chronic somatic conditions, is that in addition to writing psychiatric meds, we also write a lot of meds for people in terms of comorbid medical conditions, the things that you would expect, hypertension, diabetes, etc., because it's poor care if you don't treat the whole person. So we want to treat the whole person. Because of the intensity of the care, we are able to get people in and out generally in 9 days. And that's a pretty good turnaround when you're thinking about people that have major psychiatric symptoms. Now, this is a voluntary program, so we're not taking involuntary people, but I will tell you, we are taking people with serious major psychiatric symptoms who need to, in addition to supportive therapy, need to be medicated for those conditions. The other residential service that we offer is a residential medically monitored detoxification program where we are detoxing individuals from opiates, benzodiazepines, and alcohol. Every person that comes into that program is, of course, examined by a doc who then lays out the treatment plan. The average length of stay of that program is about 7 days. So we're moving people again in and out pretty quickly. Once they are done with treatment with us, they are transferred to a longer term facility for follow-up care. We're not just detoxing people and then letting them go to the street. We also are in the process of getting an additional license so we can keep people longer. So people will not have to be in acute withdrawal. We'll be able to accept others as well and keep people longer. The teams also provide in-home services. Not everybody that the team sees when they go out have to be admitted. Sometimes we are able to manage people through regular visits from the mobile crisis team. Like the others programs, we also respond to traumatic events as they happen. Typically, the kinds of traumatic events that we're responding to have to do with sudden death. So either a suicide or something else that not only affects the individual, but affects the community, the family, a group of people. I heard someone say earlier in the hearing about being trained by the international group in Ellicott City. And I spent several days with George and Jeff and learned a tremendous amount from them. And I have in turn trained the staff. And that's incredibly important to be able to respond to that trauma. Okay, our relationship with the BPD. I have been involved with police training since 2004. When we began to train police in CIT, and we're all doing that in some fashion, I was very involved with that, and we did that for a number of years and actually trained several hundred CIT officers. Because of the federal consent decree, all of our training is being revised, being reviewed by subject matter experts and the DOJ. So we are in a process of revising that CIT training, but we still have a significant penetration of CIT officers, just not many as many as we would like. So when I tell you that we average 2,700 mobile crisis responses a year, and our teams are going into community locations, people's homes, and so forth, it is rare that we call for police assistance. However, if we need police assistance, we're not cavalier about violence, and we will call police out, especially if their behavior is out of control. But that is a rare occurrence. And I want to emphasize that because, we're very aware of the reputation that Baltimore City has. We have a couple of special projects with the BPD that we're very proud of. One is called CRT. This is a crisis response team that is a co-responder team that pairs specially trained police officers, and that is training beyond CIT with a clinician who is employed by us. And this is the trio that is responding to calls for service. They're getting calls on police radios. They're also doing follow-ups when people have been emergency petitioned and that sort of thing. We also call them when they are available. Problem with a pilot project is they're working 7 days a week, but they're only working 8 hours a day. But we feel like there's a lot of promise in that because, as people have said earlier, it's kind of the best of both worlds. The other program that we operate is called LEAD, and LEAD stands for Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And this is where police, rather than arresting someone for a low-level crime, typically a drug crime, are able to refer that person to our team. And typically, what we're talking about is not so much pushing people toward treatment, but getting people's basic needs met. It's hard to think about treatment if you're living on the street, and even if you are involved in dealing small quantities of drugs so you can survive. So the first thing we try to do is meet the person's needs And then we get them very, very involved in what we would call case management on steroids, lots of their basic needs met. And then maybe down the road, we can talk about treatment. So that's one of our other police projects that we're very involved with. The other thing that we're in the process of doing, which I'm excited about, but also terrified about, I will admit honestly, is we are in the process of working with the 911 dispatchers to divert calls to our hotline. And so what we are working out with the fire department, because they manage 911 in Baltimore City, what we're working out are protocols for when it's appropriate to transfer a call to our hotline. Because one of the things that, you know, I've learned from police after years and years and years and years is that, you know what? People call 911 because they don't know what else to do. And 75, 80% of the time we get there and it's a domestic dispute that somebody could, you know, it's not something that's involved with a violent crime or an urgent medical situation. So we probably will be launching that in January. And when you start to think about the fact, I mean, we manage thousands of calls now, but we know that 911 in Baltimore City, I think they average about 13,000 calls a month. So I see our call volume kind of going through the roof. Like the other crisis organizations, we also work with the Public Defender's Office and lots of other people. Anybody can make a referral to us. If you look at our referrals, probably 49% of the referrals for service come from local hospitals that want to divert someone into a crisis bed or a substance abuse treatment bed. But the other 51% come from people in the community who've heard about us, you know, who've seen a PSA or something else and are looking for help. So that's a really important thing to understand when you look at our group of callers. And I think I had 15 minutes and I'm right at 14 minutes and 30 seconds. So I will stop there and entertain any questions that anyone has for me.
You are an example to the members of this committee. We have several questions. I'll go first to Delegate Griffith, then I see Delegate McComas so far. So Delegate Griffith.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Quick question. So I used to be in law enforcement, and I was actually a Marine military policeman. And in the Marine Corps, in law enforcement, almost always our most dangerous cause was domestic disputes. You mentioned in your briefing that looking to divert some of those calls and that law enforcement may not be required to respond to some of these domestic calls. How do you determine which domestic disputes would be required for law enforcement to respond to and which ones they wouldn't? Because domestic disputes, unlike most calls, as you know, can go sideways very quickly.
That's an excellent question, and they can. What we count on, which is extremely important, is the assessment that our hotline counselors do. Our hotline counselors are taking that call, they're doing an assessment, they're determining lethality, they're looking at whether or not there is significant risk. One of the other roles that our hotline counselors have is to de-escalate that caller. That's incredibly important because I'm sending a team out. I'm sending out a clinician and a nurse. And as I say, I don't want to ruin our record, which is an average of 2,700 calls a year. And I've never had a member of my team hurt in the field. And I want to keep that record before I retire. So the role of the hotline counselors is extremely important in terms of not only the assessment, but de-escalation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Delegate McComas. And then Delegate Conaway will be after Delegate McComas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple questions, and they're sort of unrelated but related. The first question is, when you're talking about the issue of minor drug crimes, because fentanyl is so involved with the heroin problem right now and can potentially be lethal because there's no way of telling, how are you handling that? Your folks that you work with the police, because to just kind of say, you're homeless, but you're taking fentanyl. I mean, that's like playing Russian roulette for the addict.
Well, there are a couple things that are important, and one is that the members of our lead team carry naloxone on their person. And I had one lead case manager who no longer works for me because he went off to greener pastures, paying him a whole lot more money than I could. But he called me one day and he said, Mr. Wiggins, I'm at number 4. And I said, number 4? What do you mean number 4? He said, I'm at number 4 in terms of the lives that I've saved with naloxone. Because what he identified was literally people who passed out on the street, people that they were providing service to. And I'm sure, as you know, fentanyl often requires multiple doses of naloxone because it is so potent. So that's something that we've met head on. But the people that we have been able to divert typically have not been selling naloxone, they've been taking it. And so that becomes really a medical problem in terms of an emergency response and detoxification. This one counselor saved 4 lives. So that's an excellent question.
The other quick question I want to ask you is, Harford County, we have a 911 command center, and that takes all the calls for the police and for probably other county government that uses it, as well as the fire companies, because we have independent fire companies in Harford County. Mm-hmm. I'm curious as to, you indicated that the Baltimore City Fire Department controls the 911 center. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of surprised that that you haven't, that it's not a generalized command center that handles all the calls and training to deal with all the different issues.
I've learned a lot because I spend a day sitting with 911 operators wearing a headset and listening to the calls that they take. But in the city, they are essentially, there's a very interesting relationship that I'm not going to sit here and act like I totally understand it, but there's a very close relationship between 911, the operating, the command center, and the BPD. And that's, of course, an issue that you're dealing with systems. And so that's way above my pay grade. I'm just trying to play the cards that I was dealt. But I have found so far that I think this process of diversion, I'm expecting it to be successful and effective just based on the protocols that have been set up in terms of really at the operator level being able to divert calls to us. The other thing that I should say, which is incredibly important, is we're not just asking operators to divert calls, we are training them. They are involved with significant training so that they can recognize, what's a call that really will require police assistance, but also we're teaching them, just like we teach our call takers at BCRI, how to de-escalate and how to get information out of people, once they're de-escalated. So it's an interesting process, and stay tuned.
Then one quick last question, sir. Have you been able to drill down into the basically the Black churches in the communities? Because I don't know if there is, as what do I want to say, the foundation of the community, but historically they have been, and so that they're a good start, a good foundation for what you do and your ability to try to minimize the problems in the community.
Well, one of the things that I tried that I overlooked in terms of trying to keep to my tight timeline in terms of my presentation is what I didn't talk about is the significant amount of community education and outreach that we do. Since we are the only behavioral health crisis program in Baltimore City, it's important for us to let everybody know what we can do. So one of the things that we've done with churches, not only African-American churches, but we've been involved, I've been involved to come and invited to come talk to pastors and ministers and others about, you know, what we do, but also to try to help them with some of the problems and concerns that they have in terms of members of their congregation. So we've been working on that. I'm certainly not going to say that it's easy. I do think there are cultural differences. I think there can be more stigma in the African-American community about receiving and requesting mental health help. I was interviewed a couple months ago by the Afro-American who wanted to talk to me specifically about Black suicide and how come, you know, Black folks don't reach out the way that other groups might for help when they're in a suicidal crisis. And in addition to me, there was also two women who had attempted suicide, African American, and they were talking about their own struggle, whether or not they got support from family members and those kinds of things. So they are an important group, and we are trying to reach out to them. The other thing that just happened recently was Paul Nestat from Hopkins just published a research paper where he talked about the rise in African-American suicide since COVID, which I didn't know. And Paul's been a good colleague for us for a long time, but not in Baltimore City, but across the state of Maryland. Apparently, there are twice as many suicides during the period of COVID infection than there were in the previous year. So that's out there. The Sun did a piece on it, and I know people read it because my phone blew up. And then BAL called for an on-camera interview, which I haven't seen, but my wife just texted me and said one of her staff saw it. So, you know, these are concerns and nuts that, you know, we're trying to crack at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Delegate Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Wiggins.
Pleasure, sir.
How many cases have been referred to you from the police department? You gave for low-level drug offenses. You said 41% are referred to from hospitals and 59% from the community, but you didn't number from the police department.
I happen to have my cheat sheet here.
Okay.
And let me find it. We currently have about 80 participants in the LEAD program specifically.
Okay, so how would this work? Let's say someone called about an overdose. They think a family member potentially overdosed, so they called 911, and so 911 would decide whether to call you or to call the ambulance.
Well, that's a really good question. So,
thank you.
The operators will be dealing with a protocol, and believe me, an overdose requires an emergent medical response. So, because they need somebody to come out to respond to that case and to do life-saving administration of naloxone. So that's not going to get to us until maybe after the person is stable and they go to the hospital. Then the hospital may in fact refer to our addictions treatment program. So the cases that we're talking about being diverted from 911 are cases that don't have that level of need for an emergent medical response, or where there is potential violence and weapons involved and there needs to be a police response.
So the gentleman you were referring to that called you and said it was his 4th case with the naloxone, he doesn't work for you, for your agency.
Well, he did, and that was a case that once he revived the person, he took to the hospital.
So he saw the person
on the street.
He saw him on the street and he took emergency action.
That's right. That's correct.
And
in that particular, and there are other cases for that LEAD program where the person was taken to the hospital and the hospital was like, okay, the person's stable. They need detoxification treatment. We don't have a bed. And I said, we do, we'll take them with us. And we took them right to our detox program. So, there are lots of ways that we can interact, but the person first has to be safe and stable.
Right. So your people might patrol what you would call like hot areas, or areas we know that people are subject to be passed out, and see someone and give them assistance. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, and that's and the LEAD area is a designated part of the city. So we're working with officers from the Central District.
Okay, and the last question: when a person comes to your detox program and stays for 7 days, who pays for that? How's that paid for?
Typically, our biggest source of reimbursement is through Medicaid. And so if you think about our population, the overwhelming percentage of people that come in have Medicaid, have medical assistance.
Okay, thank you so very much.
Services. Thank you, sir.
I want to say I've learned quite a bit about the LEAD program in particular, and the work that's being done there is impressive. And I did want to give you a shout out and kudos for that.
Thank you.
With that, though, we're going to, it's 11:36. I'm not going to limit the next panel to 24 minutes. But having said that, I'd just keep that in mind if you're members of the committee. If you've got questions, I know that they'd be happy to take them. And quite frankly, in some ways, this is a very important part of the presentation, because I think GBRICS is going to be a very interesting and transformational project that is going to be undertaken for the next 5 years. And so with that, I will, and now that I've built them up like that, oh dear, I'd like to hear from Gail Kloss from NAMI, Adrienne Bridenstine from the Behavioral Health System of Baltimore, Tiffany Callender from the Horizon Foundation, and Nikki McCann from the Johns Hopkins Health System.
Good morning. My name is Gail Kloss, and my husband Dave and I have been residents of Howard County for over 30 years. It's a pleasure to be here today to be a part of this important and informative meeting and to share a bit about our family's history with the challenges of mental illness. And I've timed this, and it shouldn't be more than 4 or 5 minutes, so you don't have a real long briefing ahead of you, okay? So hang in there. All right, my briefing does relate to GBRICS, as was just mentioned, and that will be described in the talk which follows mine. So about my family. There's a small wooden sign in the foyer of our home that one of the older kids gave to us. And it reads, "Remember, as far as anyone knows, we are a nice, normal family." At our house, this reminder is both helpful and hopeful, for in truth, our family of 7 has struggled long and hard to get to the semi-normal place where we are today. Dave and I are proud parents to a blended family of 2 homegrown and 3 heart-grown kids. One of our youngest children was born overseas and very prematurely, under traumatic circumstances and with physical challenges that required him to undergo years of corrective surgery once he joined our family here in the States. By age 4, this young son had also begun to show signs of emotional and social disability. Over the next 10 years, his condition worsened. His moods became erratic and explosive, and he acquired one diagnostic label after another. This son, now 23, is intellectually very bright. He has proven to be an excellent writer and is capable of great humor and caring. He has held a job for the past few years, well, until last year, and he's been attending HCC, so he shows much promise. But for years, he has suffered from bipolar disorder, depression and anxiety, ADHD, reactive attachment disorder, and numerous other mental illnesses. He also has Asperger's. He has been hospitalized more than 20 times during the last 6 years. Hospitalizations, which usually began with an emergency room visit, generally for concerns related to severe depression and threats of suicide. Thankfully, he has never had any addiction issues. Through our many years of employment with NSA, Dave and I have both benefited from access to affordable health insurance for our family. This insurance has helped in times of crisis by providing coverage for emergency mental health care, as well as for regular therapy visits. As residents of Howard County, we have also benefited from the free education and support groups offered through NAMI and from the supported housing now provided to our son through the Humanum program. We are fortunate to have the resources of many local organizations which help families like ours who deal every day with the uncertainty of mental illness. Nevertheless, when a crisis situation has occurred, when we have needed immediate assessment for our son or assistance with a sudden escalation of volatile, unstable behavior, when furniture is being broken or holes punched in walls, or siblings frightened by angry shouting that can be heard out to the street, then we have frequently been at a loss as to which direction to turn for crisis intervention. Therefore, we are also parents who have lost count of the trips made to ERs and to walk-in trauma centers, who have waited many hours, often for days, in the hospital emergency rooms for mental health assessments, and who have had to call police to take our raging, out-of-control teenager from our home to the hospital. Although the officers have been trained to deal with mental health crisis situations, plastic handcuffs are still handcuffs, especially to a group of anxious siblings. We know from our personal experiences that handcuffs are not a solution for a mental health crisis. We believe that community-based behavioral health crisis services, meaning not police or hospitals, are what our community needs. The GBRICS partnership presents a great opportunity for more appropriate and timely care to those dealing with a challenging mental health episode. Often our efforts to get our son into a mental health hospital have been unsuccessful due to overcrowding, and he has had to be placed in hospital facilities that were not prepared to deal with his needs. GBRICS focuses on a system of expanded services in the community that would provide the right kind of care for individuals and families when they need it. A system based on a behavioral health crisis response rather than relying on emergency medical services. From our experience, this program represents a vital leap forward for everyone. Thank you for your time today. And from the Claus household to yours, good health and happy holidays.
Thank you, Mrs. Claus. Next.
Thank you, Gail. Good morning, everybody. I am Adrienne Bridenstine. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Communications at Behavioral Health System Baltimore. I'm going to give you an overview of what GBRICS is. But before doing that, I just want to say, I think you've heard a lot from our previous panels about some of the great models that we have across our state and across the Central Maryland that we can look to build upon, which is what GBRICS is intended to do. Build upon the strengths that we currently have within our behavioral health crisis services system. But we also acknowledge that we are asking our police officers to do way too much. We are asking them to operate as mental health clinicians, and we know that they may be getting the adequate training that they need, but training is not the silver bullet or the answer. From our point of view, what we need to be doing is building out a more robust behavioral health crisis services, and that robust, comprehensive array of behavioral health crisis services need to be valued in the same way our communities value our fire and our police and our emergency departments. So that's what GBRICS is intended to do. Build upon the strengths of those current systems. And also one of the key principles for GBRICS and our overarching goal is to reduce the overall unnecessary use of emergency departments and reduce police interaction with people with behavioral health crises. We know all too much that police, as well-intended as they come to resolve these types of crises out in the community, that all too much that's not getting the type of health outcomes that we actually want to be seeing. And sometimes, tragically, it can result in more harm than good. So one of the key principles for GBRICS is to limit and reduce the overall police interaction. And so we propose to do that with a couple of key components. But in brief summary, the GBRICS project came about as a result to responding to an RFP from the Health Services Cost Review Commission, where they released an RFP earlier this year that will provide funding for a couple of funding tracks, one being behavioral health. The HSCRC wanted to see proposals that would align with the nationally recognized Crisis Now model, and you'll hear a little bit more about that from Tiffany in a little bit. But the funding is actually coming from hospitals. It's a one-time enhancement to their rates, and this will support the GBRICS project over the course of 5 years. Next slide. So what it will do is invest $45 million over 5 years in behavioral health crisis infrastructure and services. These are some of the already identified gaps that we have within our behavioral health crisis services system. The GBRICS proposal was developed in collaboration with 17 hospitals, 4 local behavioral health authorities, which is what Behavioral Health System Baltimore is, my organization, and then leaders and experts from Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Carroll County, and Howard County. And then certainly peers, the voice of peers also helped to inform the development. Many of my colleagues that I've seen present on earlier panels were actually helping to inform the development of this proposal. But it is, so next slide. It is a regional proposal, if that, just to make that very clear, this is something that we will be investing in the infrastructure and expansion of services in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Carroll County, and Howard County. As I mentioned earlier, the overall goal, reduce unnecessary ED use and police interaction for people with behavioral health crisis. And we'll be looking to see that impact over the course of these 5 years. And we'll do that by investing in a couple of these proposal elements that I'll go through quickly. The first being what we are calling a care traffic control system. This is care traffic control. It sounds very similar to an air traffic control system. It's similar in concept. Just as you in an air traffic control center might need to know where all of the planes are in the air and how to get those planes landed safely, it's the same concept for care traffic control. We need to know where the people in crisis are, what services are deployed to help stabilize that person, and then where are they connected up to that ongoing care. So this infrastructure investment is one of the things that rose up to be a top priority for many of the partners that helped to inform the development of the GBRICS proposal. So what it would do is it's a software technology to give us the ability to have real-time capacity to track and deploy mobile crisis teams out in the community, make referrals in real time. It can coordinate scheduling appointments to outpatient clinics, for example, in real time. And it would create a regional hotline for the 4 jurisdiction region that would then be the hotline that people would call for mobile crisis or any type of crisis they might be experiencing. The next component would be expanding our mobile crisis teams. If you heard from the previous panel, all of the jurisdictions, a lot of jurisdictions in the state and all of the jurisdictions that were part of GBRICS have mobile crisis team, but to varying degrees. Some are 24/7, some are not. What we would look to do here is bring everybody to be 24/7 and then expand the number of teams across the region and also create a regional team that could help support the entire region, right? Because as you heard from a previous panel as well, people cross jurisdictions. They come into the city for their healthcare. They go to Baltimore County for their healthcare too. So we need a team that can respond in that regional manner. We would also develop regional standards that would follow national best practices, one of those being SAMHSA's National Best Practices for Crisis Services. The third component would be creating walk-in or virtual services. So this really builds upon the strengths of our current outpatient behavioral health crisis system. So outpatient mental health clinics or opioid treatment programs, for example, working with those providers to change things like their clinical model, or not clinical model, their clinical operations, so that they could offer same day or walk-in appointments for people who may just need to come in and see their counselor or connect with their case manager or therapist. The fourth component would be that community engagement and outreach. So we know as a community, we are way too conditioned to calling 911, and there are alternatives in our community, such as the crisis hotlines that you've heard about from our earlier panels. Informing people about these resources is one thing, but supporting that overall culture change and awareness is a whole other ballgame that will actually take, we think, work beyond the 5 years of this grant, but we want to support that culture change at the same time that we're building up this infrastructure for our system. And then the last component would be standing up a multi-stakeholder accountability structure to really drive the overall work and support shared decision-making and accountability amongst the many partners that were involved in helping to develop this project. Next slide. So what you see on the screen is just a very high-level timeline. But the takeaway from this is just to notice that year 1, 2, and 3 are heavy planning years. Building up the infrastructure that we need, thinking through what like those regional standards for mobile crisis, putting those out and putting those out into contracts, and then expanding mobile crisis teams. So you really we aren't going to actually start measuring impact until years 4 and 5. But that's a 5-year, like I said, it's a 5-year program. First couple of years heavier building and planning. We do hope to start with the care traffic control, which is one of those top priorities very early on, and that is a key component to helping to support a lot of the other components of the GBRICS proposal. Next slide. And then finally, I'll just cover this quickly because Nikki's going to go into more detail. We know that we've got to do a lot to sustain this project beyond the 5 years. It's got to go beyond the culture change, but some of this will be looking at making some policy change at the state level, and I'll let Nikki cover that in more detail. That's the GBRICS proposal in a nutshell, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions when the rest of my colleagues have presented.
Great. All right. I'll get started. Good morning. I am Tiffany Calendar-Erbelding. I am a program director with the Horizon Foundation in Howard County. I'm going to talk just briefly about the role of philanthropy and how we've been privileged to partner with GBRICS in this work. So next slide. Yeah. So just really quickly to share, Howard County, we are Horizon Foundation. We're located in Howard County. Our focus is health and wellness for residents of Howard County. And we really do that by our strategic grant making, building community partnerships like these, advocacy. It's all in service of underscoring health and wellness for the community. The next slide. You can see here 3 of our strategic priorities. And for us, mental health really crosses all of these 3 areas. The supporting healthy kids and families, healthy aging, and ensuring an equitable community. Mental health really touches all 3 of these areas. I believe I should finish before taking the question. Is that right? Okay, I'm going to continue. All right, next slide. Great.
I was just informing members of the committee that if they had questions to start letting me know.
Okay, I see. There you go. So then I'm gonna keep going. So I think Gail and Adrian both mentioned this, and we've heard it from several of our panelists. We still know that families and community members touch either the emergency department or law enforcement officers typically when there's a crisis situation. And we are so grateful for the crisis supports and services that we heard from today, the full array that's being provided. But we know that there is always opportunity to improve and enhance on the services that are already out in our community, because we don't want to see burdens on these areas, and we don't want to see burdens on families. We want that care to be provided all the time in the right place, in the right way. So next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Crisis Now model that Adrian touched on. Again, we know that we have a lot of crisis work and a lot of crisis components that are doing amazing things in our community already. But as Adrian shared, the goal of GBRICS is really to try to build on that great work and create even more comprehensive services. And the GBRICS model, the GBRICS work is designed to implement this thing called the Crisis Now model. That's really the germination, the idea that kind of drove where GBRICS landed. And the Crisis Now model is really a best practice model around providing crisis services. It originated in Arizona, and it's really designed to try to do what Gail really eloquently said, which is expand options and provide ways for families and individuals to receive crisis care in the appropriate setting at the appropriate time all the time. and Adrian talked about the care traffic control, so I won't spend too much time there, but I want to highlight that that's one key component of this Crisis Now model, which is considered this gold standard best practice of comprehensive crisis care. And that care traffic control model is really to, as Adrian said, have a database, see the full picture of care in the region, the full picture of availability, the full picture of where someone in a crisis might be able to receive care. It's intended to be the first line of defense, that first call that you're going to make if there is a crisis. You can contact that care traffic control center. They can see the care landscape. They know where you might be able to get in for services. That care traffic control center, one of the other pieces of data they get is where the mobile crisis teams are operating. So the mobile crisis team you see there is another component of what's considered to be a best practice crisis model. And we've seen and heard from so many of our mobile crisis teams. We've heard and seen the good work that they're doing. And as Adrian mentioned, the goal of GBRICS is to really expand on that and to be able to provide those teams, provide more teams, and provide them all for that 24/7 care. And again, so those teams would actually be dispatched and tracked by this soon to come care traffic control, which is that infrastructure that Adrian talked about that's going to be able to see the care landscape for our crisis services. And the last component of the model I'll mention are these crisis stabilization services, crisis stabilization centers. They're intended to be short, subacute, short-term places where instead of someone that might not need inpatient care per se, but they might just need some support and observation, this is another place where they'd be able to get that care in the community without having to touch point either the emergency department or the criminal justice system. So this model, as I mentioned, originated through a lot of partnerships nationally, but it's really in place and running full force, all these different components out in Maricopa County, Arizona. Next slide. So let me talk a little bit about the role of philanthropy here. We learned about the Crisis Now model a few years ago in conversations with our board and with community members, and again, kept hearing, we've got great services on the ground here, but we keep hearing about this other model that might help us expand and do what we do even better. So one of the roles that philanthropy in our foundation was able to play is we were able to seed fund a delegation to go out and see that model. So July of 2019, we took about 12 or 14 of us, went out to Maricopa County, Arizona, and we went and observed the model in practice. We visited the mobile crisis team organization that dispatches the mobile crisis teams. We talked to the crisis call center, the folks that are running the centers. We went and saw some of the crisis stabilization centers. We were able to observe the model in practice. And that's something the foundation, I'm so sorry, my office lights went off because I'm not moving. That's one of the things the foundations was able to fund at the beginning. Another thing we were able to do is we were able to provide grants to get things off the ground in terms of infrastructure. So Adrian mentioned the January 30th HSCRC proposal that was released. We were able to provide funding to bring someone on to help get that proposal, the draft, done so that we could submit for the grant and thankfully be awarded. So really what the role of philanthropy has been is to really be an innovative partner to seed some of that initial front-end funding. And moving forward, we're looking forward to being a thought partner on how we can sustain this long-term, how GBRICS can be self-sustaining. That's always the goal of philanthropy, is to see how things can be embedded and just be able to continue to sustain in perpetuity. And then also just a thought partner on how we might be able to evolve the model if other best practice opportunities arise. So with that, I will stop and hand off to Nikki.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I do not have any slides to present, but I just wanted to speak a little bit about the hospital role in pulling this proposal together. I think this committee can truly appreciate that bringing 17 hospitals and 4 local jurisdictions together to apply for a single grant is really unprecedented. And sort of what was the motivation for that? What brought everybody together? And I would say that hospitals are often on the front line of, when we know that there is not adequate access to community-based crisis services. So when there is not, somewhere for someone to go in the community who's experiencing a substance use and mental health crisis, people are often brought to an emergency department, which is often the sort of the worst setting for somebody. They may not need inpatient care, but they are experiencing acute crisis and need help. But an emergency department is a hectic place, bright lights, certainly not ideal setting for somebody experiencing a crisis. This is something that is sort of often demoralizing for staff, knowing that people aren't being treated the way that they should. Frustrating when there is inadequate services or placement for individuals. It impacts overall emergency department throughput time. So that's one of the things that contributed to all of the hospitals coming together to put this proposal together. And a sort of a statistic that may help frame this is that 60% in general, 60% of individuals who are brought to a hospital under emergency petition are discharged. They don't meet the criteria for inpatient level of care. That doesn't mean that they don't need help. That doesn't mean they aren't experiencing a crisis. They just don't meet the criteria for an admission. So that is an expensive use of hospital resources, of police resources, and it's certainly not ideal for that person experiencing a crisis. As Adrian and Tiffany mentioned, I was going to speak a little more about about the long-term sustainability of this project, and really the role that this body, the General Assembly, can play in helping to ensure the success of this project. Hospitals absolutely recognize that they have a role to play in long-term sustainability. If this is a successful project, if this is something that proves to reduce emergency department utilization, to increase community-based care, then hospitals recognize the role that they will play. But all stakeholders need to come together. The way this grant is structured, while the hospitals are the applicants for the proposal, there is not a single dollar that's retained by a hospital. So that really speaks to the desire to get this money and the funding into the community where it belongs. And so we will be coming to you likely throughout the term of the grant to look at policy changes that may be necessary to help ensure sustainability of the project. And I just wanted to conclude by saying that, if we're lucky enough, we have those moments in our career or in our personal lives to be part of something meaningful, to be part of something that really has the opportunity to make change in people's lives. And I am just so honored and pleased to be part of this collaboration. The hospital partners, BHSB, all the local governments, it's just been a true honor and a pleasure to work together to move something like this forward that we know is going to make a difference. Many years ago, I was committee staff on appropriations, and even back then, this was an issue that was brought to the committee, the lack of funding, the lack of adequate community-based mental health and substance use services. So it's just really an honor to be moving something forward that can help address that problem. Happy to take questions.
Okay, we have a question from the Vice Chair and then a question from Delegate McComas. So we'll start this time with the Vice Chair.
Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Mrs. Claus, it's just a comment. I mean, you should be really busy at this time of year, you and your husband. Like, you got a lot of little people counting on you, and mommies too. So my house included. So good luck.
Thank you. We're doing our best.
Okay. My question is for Tiffany. I have the same comments I said about grassroots to the folks on the committee about the Horizon Foundation. They just do incredible work here in Howard County on all fronts. And the Horizon Foundation has actually made sure that the Howard County delegation knows what GBRICS is aware of it, and how we could help. So I wonder, Tiffany, if you could share with the committee, how will the federal legislation that creates 988, and if you could explain what that is, intersect with and work with GBRICS.
Well, I will take all of your thanks and accolades, but then I will hand the question off to Adrian, who I know is deeply immersed in the 988 topic.
Thank you. No, that's a great question. Thank you, Vice Chair Atterbury. So it's really glad that you brought that up, because we did not cover that in the presentation. So for those who aren't aware, Congress just this past session passed federal legislation that establishes 988 to be the hotline, the phone number for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline has been around for years and years and years, and it's been a 1-800 number. And then all of our local crisis hotlines like BCRI, they connect up into this national system. It's not an easy number to remember. So Congress and the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, has established 988 as this number for the for the hotline. So what this means for us at the local, state and local level is in the 2 years, which is the amount of time that the feds have given phone carriers to transition to using this 988 number. In 2 years, that will be the number that we will be using for our crisis hotlines. So it's a huge benefit because it's much easier to remember, right? 3 numbers instead of a 1-800 number. But we know from our perspective that we've got to go beyond just changing the phone number and rebranding it and marketing it. And that's where GBRICS comes in, and having this investment in that back end infrastructure to support that centralized hotline and that 988 number is so important. And then the other thing I'll highlight that the federal legislation did is it allows states the authority to establish a sustainable funding stream for crisis services, crisis hotlines, and any other services that come out of crisis hotlines. So that could also be mobile crisis services. Right now in the state of Maryland, our crisis services are grant funded. They are not covered or reimbursed for insurance. So year to year, localities are getting state funds and local funds, whatever we can cobble together to support our crisis services. The federal legislation would give states the opportunity to change that by creating a sustainable funding source.
And to Adrian's point, I would just like to add, when you're talking about sustainable funding source, when somebody comes to the emergency department under emergency petition or with a psychiatric crisis, that is expensive bill that is often paid by Medicaid. And so crisis services could be offered at a much more much more affordable way to deliver care, if there were reimbursement for that.
Thank you. I had a follow-up. My question was answered, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Delegate McComas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just briefly want to ask a question of Ms. McCann. Harford County has the mobile crisis, as well as they have the Klein Family Crisis Center off of Bel Air Road. And I was just kind of wondering if it's kind of the Harford County, I think maybe Cecil County uses it, but it's been doing very well. And it's kind of more localized situation as opposed to what, you're going across multiple jurisdictions. And the old adage, all politics is local. I'm kind of wondering if all healthcare and mental health should be all local, because Maryland is sort of like America in miniature, and all the jurisdictions are different. I mean, they have different quirks and just kind of totally, a lot of them have different culture and different community. And I've got kind of wondering if, I think the standardization is good for research and protocol, but maybe not necessarily management. And I was wondering if you could address that concern.
Well, I'd certainly welcome input from my colleagues. I can tell you that from the hospital perspective, while there's all politics may be local, is that these individuals who come from multiple jurisdictions and multiple counties go to multiple hospitals. So somebody's behavioral health crisis certainly doesn't stop at any county or regional border. At the Johns Hopkins Hospital, at our Johns Hopkins hospitals, we see people from many jurisdictions outside of Baltimore City or outside Howard County. And I think that's the benefit for having a standardized approach to this. So when people are treated at a hospital and discharged back into the community, having standards across the community could be really helpful. So an individual or even a hospital who's doing discharge planning doesn't have to navigate the different rules from each region, which is what we have now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, seeing no further questions from the committee, I just want to say I've spoken with nearly everybody who has been a part of the briefing in some way, shape, or form over the last several months. I really do appreciate everyone's time and everyone coming and speaking to us today. I think that we've covered a great deal of ground here and learned quite a bit. And I would like to say it has been remarkable to hear all of the different panels sort of talking about each other, and the collaborations that you've been able to make across jurisdictional boundaries have been really remarkable, to say nothing of what's happening with the GBRICS proposal that is now going to become a real program here over the next 5 years. And I think holds a lot of promise as we seek to find ways to get people closer to mental health care directly, as opposed to involving police officers in moving people to mental health care. I'm not taking away from what is happening in Anne Arundel and Howard County in particular, because I think there can be a role for police officers who are engaged in the kind of work that they're doing there. But I would say I do just want to commend all of the people who came and spent the morning with us for all of the work that you're doing. And I think it has been very, very helpful to the people of the committee. So with that, that concludes the briefing here on December the 18th. For the House Judiciary Committee. I thank everybody for being here. I think we have another briefing coming up in the first week of January, and then on January the 13th, we will start our 2021 session. So you all have that to look forward to, and I know you are. Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much indeed.